There's something ancient and unsettling about the deep woods. We go there to escape, to find peace, but for those who work there, the park rangers, the forest doesn't always offer tranquility. They are the guardians of these vast, wild spaces, the first to arrive and often the last to leave. Tonight, as the summer night closes in, we're going to venture deep into the heart of our national parks. But we're not looking for scenic views. We're sharing stories from the rangers themselves, chilling encounters and strange events that defy easy explanation. We'll hear about the seasoned forest ranger who found something that wasn't supposed to be there, the unnerving truths behind a missing person case that went cold, and the eerie sounds that echo through the canyons after dark. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself. These aren't just campfire tales. These are the true, scary stories from the people who know the woods and its secrets better than anyone. My name is Benjamin Carter, though everyone who has ever shared a patch of dirt or a dusty truck cab with me just calls me Ben. For the better part of a decade, I held the title of Timber Management Specialist in Yosemite National Park. It sounds more impressive than it is. In reality, it meant I was a glorified tree doctor whose primary patients were either dead, dying, or posing a threat to the living. My domain was the vast, breathing expanse of the Sierra Nevada, a world of granite titans and whispering pines. My job was to walk the line between preservation and safety, a constant, delicate dance with nature's relentless cycle of growth and decay. Most of my days were spent deep in the backcountry, far from the paved roads and the smiling faces of tourists. I wasn't a law enforcement ranger, the kind who deals with lost hikers and campground disputes. I was part of the forest's unseen maintenance crew. My tools were a can of spray paint, a handheld GPS, and a deep, ingrained understanding of forest ecology. I marked trees for removal, those that leaned too precariously over a trail, those hollowed out by disease and ready to topple in the next big storm, and most frequently, those that stood as silent, blackened casualties of wildfire. The work was methodical, often solitary, and it suited me. There's a certain kind of peace you can only find when the only sounds are the wind in the canopy and the crunch of your own boots on pine needles. You learn to read the forest, to see the stories written in the bark of a lightning, scarred cedar, or the rings of a fallen giant. You feel the pulse of the place, a rhythm that has beaten steadily for millennia. It was a world that made sense, a world governed by predictable, logical rules. Fire clears the underbrush, making way for new life. Trees grow, they mature, they die, they fall, and they return to the soil. It was a cycle I respected, a process I was there to facilitate, not to interrupt. The summer I'm telling you about was a particularly hot and dry one. The air was thick with the scent of sun, baked pine, and dry earth, and the ever-present thread of fire hung in the haze that softened the edges of the distant peaks. We were working a section designated as the Eagle's Scar, a sprawling tract of land on the park's western edge that had been ravaged by a major fire 3 years prior. It was a landscape of stark contrasts. The skeletal remains of incinerated firs and pines stood like charcoal monuments, while a vibrant carpet of wildflowers and young saplings pushed its way up from the ash-rich soil. It was a place of death and fierce, defiant life, beautiful and haunting in equal measure. My crew for this section consisted of 2 men, loggers contracted for the felling work. Sal was the lead, a man in his late 50s with a face like a topographical map, every line and crease earned from a lifetime of hard labor under the California sun. He was quiet, efficient, and handled a chainsaw with the casual artistry of a sculptor. His partner was Ricky, a kid barely in his 20s, full of nervous energy and eager to prove himself. They were good men, professionals who understood the risks and respected the power of the trees they were tasked with bringing down. We had been working the Eagle's Scar for over a week, a slow and steady process of identifying, marking, and felling. The days fell into a familiar rhythm. I would move ahead, my boots sinking into the soft, black soil, evaluating each tree. I'd check for structural integrity, signs of infestation, and the potential fall path. A splash of orange paint on the trunk was a death sentence. I'd log the coordinates, move on, and behind me, the roar of Sal's chainsaw would begin, a temporary, violent intrusion into the forest's deep silence, followed by the thunderous crash of a falling tree. The tree in question was a ponderosa pine, a true monster that must have been ancient before the fire even touched it. It stood on a slight rise, its trunk thick and gnarled, at least 5 feet in diameter. The fire had licked up its sides, leaving the lower half deeply charred and blackened, but the upper branches, though bare, still reached for the sky like skeletal fingers. It was a hazard, no doubt about it. It was half rotted, and its position meant that if it fell, it could slide down the slope and block a critical fire access road below. I marked it without a second thought. It was just another tree. When Sal and Ricky got to it, they took their time. Felling a tree of that size, especially one with potential rot, is a dangerous business. I was about 100 yards away, marking a smaller cluster of firs, when the sound began. It wasn't the usual steady roar of the saw biting into wood. It was a grating, high-pitched scream, a shriek of tortured metal. Sal was a pro. The moment a saw bucks or binds, you kill the power. The engine died abruptly, and a profound silence fell over the clearing, heavier and more complete than before. It was the kind of silence that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I turned, my hand resting on the hatchet on my belt. Ricky was standing back, his eyes wide, his face pale beneath his tan. Sal was staring at the cut in the tree, his saw resting silently at his feet. He didn't move. "Everything all right over there, Sal?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. Sal didn't answer for a moment. He just slowly shook his head, a gesture of pure disbelief. He finally looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Ben," he said, his voice raspy, "you better come see this." I walked over, my boots crunching on the debris. The cut was about halfway through the massive trunk. The chain on Sal's saw was visibly damaged. A few of the teeth snapped clean off. "Hit something." Sal stated, the words flat and unnecessary. Felt like solid steel or rock. Never felt anything like it. I knelt, peering into the deep gash the saw had made. The inside of the tree was a mess of splintered, half-rotten pulp and dark, damp wood. But deep within the cut, exactly where the saw had stopped, something was embedded in the heartwood. At first, it was just a shape, a patch of pale color that didn't belong. It was smooth, almost luminous against the dark, fibrous wood. "What is that?" Ricky whispered, taking a hesitant step closer. "Some kind of weird fungus." I pulled my hatchet from my belt, using the flat back of the head to carefully scrape away the pulpy wood chips. The shape became clearer, more defined. It was not fungus. It was not rock. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing, trying to fit into a logical framework. There was no framework for this. As I cleared the last of the debris away, we all saw it, wedged deep within the wood, so seamlessly integrated that the grain of the tree seemed to flow around it, was a hand. It was a human hand, severed cleanly at the wrist. It was perfectly, impossibly preserved. The skin was pale and waxy, like old marble, with no sign of decay or discoloration. The fingers were slender and gracefully curled, the nails immaculate, as if they'd just been manicured. There was no blood, no desiccated flesh, no hint of the violence that must have put it there. It wasn't just in the tree, it looked like it was a part of the tree, fused to the inner wall as if it had grown there from a seed. The wood and the flesh were one. The three of us stood frozen, staring into the heart of that wounded pine. The sounds of the forest, the wind, the distant call of a hawk, the buzzing of insects had vanished. The only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart. This was a place I knew, a world I understood. But this was an impossibility. This was a violation of every natural law I had ever known. And in the suffocating silence of that burned scar, I could have sworn the tree itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. Time ceased to have meaning. We stood there, three men silhouetted against a dying sun, mesmerized by the obscene artifact nestled in the tree's core. The initial shock, that cold, electric jolt, slowly gave way to a creeping tide of questions, each more unsettling than the last. Ricky was the first to break the spell. He made a choked, gagging sound and stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard in the dirt. He scrambled away on all fours, his face a mask of pure terror, not stopping until he was a good 20 feet away, where he retched into a patch of fireweed. Sal remained motionless, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle of his silent chainsaw. He was a man who had seen his share of logging accidents, of mangled limbs and sudden death. But this was different. This wasn't an accident, it was a perversion. In all my years, he finally whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. In all my damn years. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. My own mind was a frantic whirlwind, trying to build a cage of logic around the impossibility before me. A hoax. Could someone have somehow carved out a section of the living tree, inserted a wax hand, and then seamlessly sealed the trunk again, leaving no scar, no trace of entry, only for the tree to grow around it for years? The complexity, the sheer pointlessness of such a prank was staggering. And what about the way the wood grain flowed? It didn't just surround the hand, it embraced it. The fibers of the ponderosa pine and the pale flesh appeared to merge at a microscopic level, and Sal saw it hadn't just hit an object inside the tree. Sal swore the trunk was solid. He said the saw screamed. "Ben, what do we do?" Sal's question cut through my chaotic thoughts. He was looking at me, his eyes pleading for an answer, for a return to the normal world of procedure and protocol. I was the Park Service guy. I was supposed to be in charge. I swallowed, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "We call it in?" I said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. "We treat it as a potential crime scene, discovery of human remains." Even as I said it, the phrase felt absurd. Human remains conjured images of bones, of bodies. It did not conjure this pristine manicured hand resting in its wooden tomb as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I unclipped the radio from my vest, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected from my brain. I switched to the primary channel for the LE Rangers. "Yosemite Dispatch, this is Timber Management, Ben Carter, over." The reply came back instantly, a familiar, calm female voice. "Go ahead, Ben." "This is Dispatch." "Dispatch, I'm with a felling crew in the Eagle Scar section. We're at grid coordinates." I read them off my GPS, my voice shaking slightly. We've found something. We need LE Rangers to respond." "Copy that, Ben. What's the nature of the discovery?" I hesitated, the truth feeling like a stone in my throat. How could I possibly say it? "Dispatch, we have found what appears to be human remains." "Copy, Ben. Can you confirm location of the remains? Are they contained?" I looked at the hand in the tree. "Negative. Dispatch. The remains they're inside a tree. A beat of silence on the other end. It stretched for an eternity. Ben, repeat your last. Did you say inside a tree?" "That's affirmative, Dispatch. It appears to be a human hand. It's embedded in the trunk of a ponderosa pine we were felling." Another, longer silence. I could picture the dispatcher, probably Sarah, leaning forward, pushing a button to make sure she wasn't mishearing me. I could imagine the look she was giving her partner. "Okay, Ben," she said finally, her professional calm strained. "Understood. Stay at your location. Do not touch or disturb anything further. An LE team is en route. EDA is approximately 45 minutes. Carter, are you and your crew safe?" The question hung in the air. Were we safe? A new kind of fear, cold and primal, began to seep into me. We were in a vast, isolated wilderness with something that defied all explanation. The sun was getting lower, casting long, distorted shadows that wreathed and twisted among the skeletal trees. The eagle's scar, which had felt hauntingly beautiful that morning, now felt actively malevolent. "We're safe," I lied, or maybe I was just trying to convince myself. "We'll wait for the LE team." "Carter out." The 45 minutes felt like a lifetime. Ricky sat huddled by our supply packs, refusing to look at the tree. Sal paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at the trunk and then quickly looking away, as if afraid it might have changed. I stood guard, my hand never straying far from my hatchet, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching figure. The forest was no longer a place of peace. It was an audience, and we were the unwilling actors in a play we didn't understand. The LE Rangers arrived in a cloud of dust, their white truck bouncing up the fire road. 2 men got out. The driver was Dave Morrison, a senior ranger I knew well. He was a tall, lanky man with a perpetually skeptical expression and a dry wit. His partner was younger, someone I didn't recognize, with a fresh out of the academy haircut and an earnest, serious face. "Ben," Dave said, striding over, his eyes already scanning the scene. Sarah on dispatch sounded like she'd seen a ghost. "What in God's name are we looking at?" I didn't say anything. I just pointed at the tree. Dave and the new ranger walked over. They stopped. They stared. The younger ranger's jaw went slack. Dave's cynical mask dissolved into pure, unadulterated astonishment. He knelt down, just as I had, getting close but not touching. He pulled out a high-powered flashlight even in the fading daylight and shone it into the cut. "I'll be damned," he breathed. He looked at Sal, then at Ricky, then back at me. "Is this some kind of joke? Does it look like a joke?" Sal grunted, his voice raw. "That thing broke my best saw." "The trunk was solid before we cut," I added, my voice firm. "We all saw it. There was no hole, no seam, nothing?" Dave stood up, running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked at his partner, who was still speechless. "All right. Well, this is a new one." He switched back into professional mode, but his voice was tight. "Okay, we secure the scene. Nobody touches anything. We're going to have to take the whole damn section." The logistics were a nightmare. They couldn't just cut the hand out. It was evidence. The entire portion of the trunk had to be preserved. This meant another, more delicate felling operation. Sal, looking pale and sick, had to retrieve his backup saw. Under the harsh, artificial glare of portable floodlights the Rangers set up, he and Ricky made 2 more careful cuts, one above and one below the gash, freeing a massive, 5-foot diameter cylinder of wood. The sound of the saw was different this time. As it bit into the wood above and below the hand, it didn't scream, but it whined a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Maybe it was just my imagination, my frayed nerves, but it felt like the tree was groaning in protest. When the final cut was made and the massive section was rolled onto a heavy, duty tarp, a strange, earthy yet faintly sweet smell filled the air. It was the smell of sawdust and rot, but with an undertone of something else. Something cloyingly organic. The official report was already taking shape in the Rangers' conversation. Hoax was the word they kept coming back to. Elaborate prank. They theorized about taxidermy, about chemicals, about someone with a lot of time and a twisted sense of humor. They had to find a rational explanation, a box to put this in. But Sal, Ricky, and I knew what we had felt. We had stood there when the saw screamed as if it were alive. We had looked into the heart of that tree and seen the impossible. As the LE Rangers carefully wrapped the monstrous log in canvas, preparing it for a long, slow journey back to civilization and analysis, I looked at the wounded Ponderosa. A dark, gaping hole now scarred its trunk. It looked like a mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. The hand was gone, but the feeling it left behind, a cold dread that had nothing to do with pranks or hoaxes, was just beginning to take root in my soul. The days following the discovery were a blur of sterile offices and formal statements. Sal, Ricky, and I were interviewed separately, then together, then separately again. We recounted the story so many times that the words began to lose their meaning, the sharp edges of the memory worn smooth by repetition. We told them about the solid trunk, the shriek of the chainsaw, the impossible fusion of flesh and wood. Dave Morrison, the LE Ranger, listened patiently, his face a careful neutral mask, but the younger Ranger couldn't hide the skepticism in his eyes. To them, we were becoming part of the problem, 3 unreliable narrators in a story that was already too bizarre to be believed. The official report came out 2 weeks later. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic dismissal. The section of the log had been sent to a forensics lab in Sacramento, a place of stainless steel and unwavering rationalism. Their conclusion was neat, tidy, and utterly infuriating. The hand, they determined, was not human tissue. It was a cleverly constructed facsimile, an intricate sculpture made from a sophisticated polymer, blended with animal-based gelatin to mimic the texture and density of flesh. They found microscopic tool marks suggesting it had been carved. They claimed the fusion with the wood was the result of a powerful epoxy and the natural pressure of the tree's growth over a period of 5 to 7 years after it had been inserted into a pre-existing hollow. The official story was that we had been the victims of an elaborate and highly sophisticated prank. A hoax. That was the word they stamped on the file, closing the case. It was an explanation that satisfied everyone who hadn't been there. It made sense. It fit neatly into the world they understood, but it was a lie. We knew it. There was no pre-existing hollow. Sal had been logging for 40 years. He knew the sound and feel of solid wood. There were no tool marks visible to the naked eye, only the seamless, terrifying union of 2 things that should never have been joined. And the scream of the saw, the report made no mention of that. How do you quantify a sound that felt like a death cry? The incident broke our small crew apart. Ricky quit 2 days after the interviews. He told me he couldn't sleep, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale, waxy fingers curled in the dark. He was going to pour concrete in the city. He said somewhere there were no trees. I never saw him again. Sal finished the contract, but the easy rhythm of his work was gone. He became jumpy and sullen. He started talking to himself, casting nervous glances at the trees before he made a cut. The week after the report came out, he packed up his saws and retired. He told me the forest didn't feel right anymore. It's like, the volume's been turned up, Ben, he'd said, his voice low. I hear things now. In the wind, in the wood itself. It's watching. And then there was me. I couldn't quit. Yosemite was my life, my church, my home. But the sanctity of it had been violated. The peace I once found in the solitude of the deep woods was replaced by a low, persistent hum of anxiety. My world of predictable, natural cycles had been shattered. I started looking into the park's archives, spending my evenings poring over dusty records of missing persons. Yosemite has always been a place that swallows people. Hikers who step off a trail and vanish, climbers who fall into bottomless crevices. The park is vast and its secrets are well kept. I found dozens of cases stretching back over a century. Most had explanations. A bit of clothing found, a last known location. But some were just gone. People who walked into the woods and were never seen again. I started cross-referencing the locations of these disappearances with old logging maps and fire histories. There was no clear pattern, just a series of random, tragic points scattered across a massive landscape. But sometimes, late at night, with the files spread across my cabin floor, I would feel a chill. A disappearance here, a strange report of unusual animal behavior. There a notation from an old ranger's journal about a section of forest that felt wrong. They were just whispers, disconnected threads. But what if they weren't? I never walked through the eagle's scar again. Even from a distance, the sight of that wounded ponderosa with its dark, gaping maw made my stomach clench. The official explanation was a hoax, but that explanation never answered the most important questions. Who would create such a thing and why? How could they have executed it so flawlessly, leaving no trace? And if it wasn't a hoax, what was it? A remnant of some forgotten ritual? A warning? Or was it something else, something far more terrifying? Was it simply a part of the forest's own biology, a rare and monstrous form of growth that, by pure chance, we had been the ones to cut open? Years have passed. I still work in timber management, though I'm more of an administrator now, my boots less dusty than they used to be. The memory has faded as memories do, softening into the shape of a good ghost story I tell to new recruits to scare them into being careful. I tell them the official version, of course. The story of the elaborate prank, but I never forget the truth. I never forget the waxy pallor of the skin, the perfect nails, the way the wood grain flowed into the wrist. I never forget the sound the chainsaw made. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry, in a part of the park where few people ever go, I feel it. It's the feeling Sal talked about, a watchfulness, a presence in the ancient silence of the sequoias and the pines. I find myself looking at the trees differently, not just as timber or hazards, but as vessels. I see the gnarled burls, the dark hollows, the places where the bark has twisted into strange, suggestive shapes. And I wonder, just last fall I was surveying a remote area near the park's eastern boundary. It was a quiet, old-growth section, untouched by fire for centuries. As I was marking a trail, my eyes were drawn to a massive sugar pine. Its bark was thick and deeply furrowed with age, and there about chest high was a scar. It wasn't a blaze mark or damage from a falling limb. It was a pale, smooth patch of wood, lighter than the surrounding bark, almost glowing in the dappled sunlight. It was shaped unmistakably, like a hand. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't touch it. I didn't call it in. I didn't take a picture. I just looked at it, and I felt the forest looking back at me. Then I turned around, and I walked away, leaving the tree and its terrible secret to the silence. Some things, I've learned, are not meant to be cut open. Some things are better left buried in the wood. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and for 30 years, I served as a search and rescue officer in the vast, deceptive wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. 30 years is a long time to spend looking for people who don't want to be found, or worse, people who desperately do but can't. You see a lot. You learn the patterns of the lost, the rhythms of panic, and the cold, hard logic of the wild. Most of the time, when someone goes missing, there's a reason that fits neatly into a report. A twisted ankle on a poorly chosen trail, a sudden, blinding fog that turns a familiar path into a maze. A tourist from the flatlands who wildly underestimates how quickly the weather can turn in these mountains, trading a sunny afternoon for hypothermic night with nothing but a T-shirt for warmth. We find them, we bring them back, we file the paperwork. It's a job, a grim one often, but a logical one. But this story isn't about the logical cases. It's about the ones that defy logic, the files that sit in the back of the cabinet, gathering a different kind of dust, a residue of pure, gnawing unease. These are the stories the old-timers tell the new recruits, not to scare them, but to warn them, to remind them that the park has its own rules, ancient and indifferent to ours. And the most unsettling of these stories, the one that became a ghost in our own ranks, began long before my time but cast a shadow that I would one day have to walk into. It was the case of 6-year-old Dennis Martin. The year was 1969, I was just a boy myself, living miles away, with no idea I'd one day wear the same uniform as the men who searched for him. The story is a staple of park lore. The Martin family was enjoying a beautiful June afternoon at Spencefield, a large grassy bald high in the mountains. The kids, Dennis, his older brother, and two other boys, were planning a simple, harmless prank. They would split up, hide behind bushes, and jump out to scare the adults. A classic childhood game. The other boys jumped out. Dennis never did. He vanished in the few moments it took for his father and grandfather to turn their heads. Gone. Not a sound, not a cry for help. Just silence. The search that followed was, and still is, the largest in the park's history. Hundreds of people scoured the area. The National Guard was called in. Even Green Berets, elite soldiers trained for survival in the harshest conditions, joined the effort. They combed every inch of that mountain. They searched for weeks, which turned into months. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of his red shirt. Not a single sign that a little boy had been there at all. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. Over the years, the Dennis Martin case became a cautionary tale, a piece of local mythology. Theories swirled like mountain mist. Was he taken by a bear? Unlikely. A bear attack is a violent, messy affair. There would have been evidence. Was he abducted? Perhaps. One family reported seeing a looking man hiding in the bushes on the day Dennis disappeared, and later heard an enormous, sickening scream. But the lead went nowhere. The man was never found. The most chilling theory, the one whispered around campfires, was that something else took him. Something that doesn't leave tracks. For decades, that case was an island of pure mystery. A reminder that for all our maps, compasses, and technology, we are just guests here. Then, years later, when I was a seasoned officer with gray in my beard, the echo of that mystery returned, and this time it was my case. It started on a sweltering day in late July. The park was teeming with summer visitors, the air thick with the smell of pine needles and barbecue smoke. The call came in just as the sun began to dip below the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A missing child. A 6-year-old girl named Lily. My stomach tightened. The details were eerily familiar. She was with her parents at a campsite near a huckleberry patch, not more than a few miles from where Dennis Martin was last seen. Her parents had turned their backs for just a minute to fold a map. When they looked up, she was gone. We initiated a standard type I search protocol immediately. We established a perimeter, set up a command post, and began organizing grid searches. The first few hours of any search for a child are frantic, controlled chaos. You're racing against the clock, against the setting sun, against the rising tide of parental terror. But as we geared up, something else was rising. The air grew heavy, static, and the sky in the west began to boil with a dark, bruised-looking mass of clouds. A freak thunderstorm. It wasn't on any forecast. It rolled in with an unnatural speed and violence, as if summoned. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at our equipment. And then the rain came. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. A solid wall of water that turned the forest floor into a churning river of mud and leaves. Thunder cracked overhead with the force of an explosion, so close you could feel it in your bones. Any tracks, any scent for the dogs, any sign Lily might have left was gone in an instant. Washed away. Erased, we were blind. We huddled under tarps, the rain hammering down, the world reduced to the narrow beam of our headlamps and the roaring darkness. It felt personal. It felt like the park itself was actively working against us, trying to hide something. The search was crippled before it had even truly begun. We could only wait for the storm to pass, knowing that with every minute, a little girl in the woods was getting colder, more scared, and further away. As I stood there, the rain plastered my hair to my face. One thought kept circling in my mind. Cold and sharp as the wind, it's happening again. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. One moment, the world was a roaring chaos of wind and water. The next, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the dripping of water from a billion leaves and the distant gurgle of newly formed streams. The moon, a pale, sickly crescent, appeared between shredded clouds, casting a weak, silvery light on a world that had been scoured clean. For us, the search team, that was the problem. The forest floor was a blank slate, a muddy canvas wiped of all evidence. The deluge had not just washed away Lily's tracks, it had washed away our hope. We worked through the night, our headlamps cutting uselessly through the thick, humid air. The forest felt different, heavier. The usual night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the call of a whip-poor will, were absent. It was as if the storm had frightened everything into silence, or perhaps something else had. Lily's parents were at the command post, a small tent that seemed impossibly fragile against the immense darkness of the woods. Her mother was wrapped in a blanket, her face a mask of numb disbelief, while her father paced back and forth, his eyes wild with a terror I knew all too well. Every time I had to look them in the eye and report, nothing yet. A piece of my own soul chipped away. Day 2 dawned gray and oppressive. We expanded the search grid, bringing in more volunteers, good people from nearby towns who gave up their day to walk shoulder to shoulder through dense undergrowth, calling a name that was never answered. We searched ravines slick with mud, pushed through thickets of rhododendron so dense you couldn't see your own feet, and scanned the banks of swollen creeks. The park felt actively hostile. Thorn bushes seemed to grab at our clothes with unusual tenacity, and the ground, saturated and unstable, tried to suck the boots right off our feet. By the end of day 2, a grim mood had settled over the entire operation. We had covered miles of punishing terrain and found nothing. Not a candy wrapper, not a shoelace, not a single blonde hair caught on a branch. It was a statistical impossibility. A child, especially a terrified one, leaves a trail of some kind. They drop things, they break branches, they leave scuff marks. Lily had left nothing. It was Dennis Martin all over again, a perfect, complete, and utterly maddening disappearance. That night, huddled around a sputtering campfire at the command post, the whispers started. The younger rangers, full of bravado just a day before, were now quiet and wide-eyed. They spoke in low tones about the feeling of being watched, about shadows that seemed to move on their own at the edge of their vision. One volunteer, a hardened hunter who knew these woods better than his own backyard, swore he heard a little girl's laughter carried on the wind, clear as day, from a direction where no searchers were posted. He packed his gear and left before sunrise, refusing to go back into the forest. I found myself talking to Dwight, a grizzled old ranger on the verge of retirement. He'd been a rookie during the Dennis Martin search. He sat apart from the others, whittling a piece of wood with a steady hand, his face a road map of wrinkles. "It feels the same," he said without looking up, his voice a low rumble. "The air, it gets thick, like you're breathing water. And the quiet, it ain't a peaceful quiet. It's a holding, it's breath kind of quiet. What do you think happened to him, Dwight?" "To Dennis?" I asked, the question I'd wanted to ask for years. He stopped whittling and looked at me, his pale blue eyes seeming to look right through me. "People think the park is just trees and rocks and animals. It ain't. It's old Arthur. Older than anything we can rightly understand. There are things in here that were old when the mountains were young. They don't play by our rules. They don't even know we have rules. Sometimes they just take an interest." He looked back down at his piece of wood. "And sometimes what they're interested in, they keep." His words did little to comfort me. They coiled in my gut like a cold snake. Day 3 was more of the same. More fruitless searching, more strained faces, more hope draining away like water into the soil. We were transitioning from a rescue to a recovery. It's the hardest part of the job, the silent admission that you're no longer looking for a living person. You're just looking for something to give the family closure. It was on the morning of the 4th day that the call came over the radio. The voice was young, a ranger named Peterson, and it was cracked with disbelief. "Command, this is Patrol 4. You're not going to believe this. We've found her." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. But it was followed by a cold spike of adrenaline. The questions came fast.
"Is she okay? What's her condition? What's your location?" There was a pause.
Then Peterson's voice came back, strained. "She's fine, sir. She's completely fine. But her location, sir, we're on the summit of Eagle's Nest Peak." The radio went silent in the command tent. Everyone looked at each other. Dwight slowly shook his head. Eagle's Nest Peak. It was nearly 12 miles from the campsite. The trail to get there was a brutal, relentless climb, gaining over 3,000 feet in elevation. It was a place that would take a seasoned, well-equipped hiker a full, arduous day to reach. For a 6-year-old girl alone in the dark after a massive storm, it wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. "And sir," Peterson's voice crackled again, "there's something else. You need to see this." It took us 2 hours by ATV and another hour of hard hiking to reach them. We found Peterson and his partner standing on a rocky outcrop near the summit, and there, sitting calmly on a large, sun-warmed boulder, was Lily. She was wearing her pink t-shirt and shorts, now smudged with dirt. Her blonde hair was a bit tangled, but her face was serene. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shivering. She looked for all the world like a child patiently waiting for her parents to finish their conversation. She was completely, miraculously unharmed. But as I got closer, the wrongness of the scene hit me. Her little sneakers and her bright yellow rain jacket, the one her mother had described with such heartbreaking detail, were not on her. They were placed at the base of a nearby twisted pine tree, sitting side by side, perfectly neat and dry, as if they'd been set out for collection. I knelt in front of her, keeping my voice soft. "Lily? It's Arthur. We've been so worried about you. Are you okay?" She looked at me, her blue eyes clear and calm, and gave a small, beatific smile. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the most unsettling expression I had ever seen on a child. "I'm okay," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "Can you tell me how you got all the way up here, sweetie?" I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Did someone help you?" Her smile widened just a fraction. She nodded slowly, her eyes looking past me, towards the deep woods that stretched out below the peak. "The big, quiet man showed me," she said, her voice full of a simple, chilling sincerity. "He wanted to show me where the best berries grow." The words hung in the thin mountain air, simple, innocent, and more terrifying than any scream. The big, quiet man. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through the relief of having found her. I looked from Lily's serene, smiling face to Peterson, whose own face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. He had heard it too. We all had. The woods around us, which had seemed merely vast and indifferent moments before, now felt actively malevolent, listening. The silence that followed her statement was profound, a vacuum where 1,000 logical explanations should have been, but none came. "Lily," I said, my voice barely a whisper, forcing myself to remain calm for her sake. "Where is the big man now?" She didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on some distant point in the sprawling green canopy below us, her small smile unwavering. It was as if she was sharing a secret with the landscape itself. There was no one there. There was nothing but miles of trees and rock. The journey down from Eagle's Nest Peak was the strangest and most unnerving experience of my 30-year career. I carried Lily most of the way. She was light in my arms, but felt like a lead weight on my soul. She didn't speak another word, simply resting her head on my shoulder with a placid trust that was deeply unsettling. She didn't seem tired, hungry, or thirsty. When we offered her water, she politely refused. When we offered her a high-energy bar, she just shook her head. She was perfectly content, a calm little island in a sea of our own rising panic. The other rangers were silent, exchanging troubled glances over Lily's head. We were all thinking the same thing. How did a 6-year-old girl survive for 3 nights in this wilderness, through a violent thunderstorm, and end up 12 miles away and 3,000 feet higher, without a scratch on her and with no memory of hardship? And who or what was the big, quiet man? The description echoed the long-forgotten witness report from the Dennis Martin case. The looking man, seen in the bushes. But Lily's description felt different. It wasn't the description of a human kidnapper. It was the description of something else. The reunion with her parents was a chaotic explosion of emotion. Tears, cries of relief, desperate hugs. For a few beautiful moments, the sheer joy of it all eclipsed the strangeness. But as their initial panic subsided, they too began to notice Lily's odd detachment. She accepted their hugs, but her eyes remained distant, that same placid, empty smile on her face. When they asked her where she'd been, she just repeated her line. "I was with the big, quiet man. He showed me the berries." She didn't seem to grasp the terror they had gone through. It was like she had been on a pleasant field trip, from which she had just returned. The official debriefing was a nightmare of bureaucracy grinding against the impossible. How do you write a report about this? I sat in front of my typewriter, the missing person found form in front of me, and I couldn't fill it out. Condition of subject and harmed. Location found Eagle's Nest Peak. How do I explain the discrepancy between those two facts? How do I file a report that says a child was teleported up a mountain? We questioned Lily gently over the next few days, with a child psychologist present. Her story never changed, but the details she offered were maddeningly vague and deeply disturbing. The big, quiet man had no face she could remember, like looking at a shadow. He didn't walk, he was just there. He didn't talk with his mouth, but she knew what he was saying. He kept her warm during the storm, not with a blanket, but because it wasn't cold near him. She said he smelled like dirt after rain and old rocks. She drew a picture for the psychologist. It was a child's typical drawing, a green scribble for the forest, a yellow circle for the sun, and in the middle of it, a tall, featureless figure drawn in black crayon, a shape that was more of a void than a person, towering over a tiny stick figure that was meant to be her. The official explanation, the one that went into the final report, was that Lily, in a state of shock and disorientation, had wandered an impossible distance in a fugue state. It was a theory born of desperation, a way to close a file that refused to be closed. No one believed it. Not really. We swept the area around Eagle's Nest Peak for days. We found no tracks other than our own and Lily's. No signs of a campsite, no discarded food wrappers, no evidence of another human being. We only found one other thing. In a small, sheltered crevice not far from where Lily was sitting, we found a small patch of huckleberries. The berries there were larger, darker, and sweeter than any I'd ever tasted in the park. They were growing in a place they shouldn't have been able to grow. I talked to Dwight one last time before he retired. I told him everything about the location, the neatly placed shoes, the big, quiet man. He just nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I didn't keep her, he said softly. Just borrowed her. Showed her something. Maybe it's getting bolder. Or maybe it's just lonely. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. There are some things in this park you don't find, Arthur. They find you. You just have to pray you're not what they're looking for. I stayed with search and rescue for another 15 years after that, but I was never the same. The Lily Martin case, as we unofficially called it, a grim tribute to its predecessor, became my ghost. I never saw Lily or her family again. They moved away shortly after, trying to escape a memory that I knew would follow them. For me, the park was no longer just a place of beauty and danger. It was a place with secrets, with a presence that watched from the corner of your eye. Every time I went into the deep woods, I felt it. A stillness that wasn't peaceful. A silence that was listening. I'd find myself looking at the shadows, wondering if one of them was taller, darker, and more solid than the rest. I never looked for long. I was afraid that one day I might see it look back. My name is Chloe Sterling. That's the official name on the paperwork, the one that got me this posting as a rookie park ranger in one of the most unforgivingly beautiful places on Earth, Lake Clark National Park, Alaska. Most people who hear that picture are rugged, Grizzly Adams type, a woman carved from granite with a lifetime of wilderness survival under her belt. I'm not that woman. I'm 5'6", with a degree in environmental science that felt far more useful in a climate-controlled university library than it does out here. And my primary motivation for trading a bustling city for this profound isolation wasn't bravery, it was exhaustion. I was tired of the noise. Not just the traffic and the sirens, but the constant, low, level hum of humanity, the push notifications, the pressure to be social, the endless stream of opinions and curated lives online. I craved a silence so complete it would feel like a physical presence, a quiet so deep it could swallow all the noise I carried inside me. Alaska promised that. Lake Clark, with its roadless interior and outposts separated by miles of untamed wilderness, seemed like the perfect prescription for a soul worn thin by the modern world. My assigned station was a remote cabin on the shore of one of the park's lesser, known glacial lakes. The nearest human being was my supervisor, Mark, stationed at a slightly larger outpost a good 15 miles south, a distance that felt more like 100 when you considered the terrain. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, built of thick logs that had weathered decades of brutal winters. It had a wood, burning stove that became the heart of my existence, a small propane-powered generator for a few hours of electricity each night, and a satellite radio that was my only link to the outside world. For the first month, it was paradise. My days fell into a comfortable, solitary rhythm. I'd wake with the pale light, my breath fogging in the frigid air. After a breakfast of oatmeal and strong coffee, I'd spend my time on patrol, checking trail cameras, monitoring animal populations, and ensuring the park's fragile ecosystem remained undisturbed. I learned the landscape like the back of my hand, the jagged peaks that tore at the sky, the dense spruce forest that whispered in the wind, the vast, silent tundra that stretched to the horizon. I saw grizzly bears fishing for salmon, moose wading through wetlands with impossible grace, and eagles soaring on thermal currents. The silence I had craved was real. It was a living thing, broken only by the cry of a loon, the crack of a glacier, or the howl of a distant wolf. I felt my frayed nerves begin to knit themselves back together. I was healing. Then the first heavy snow came, It fell without fanfare, a silent, persistent curtain of white that transformed the world overnight. The sharp edges of the landscape softened, the vibrant greens and browns of autumn were erased, and the world was reduced to a monochrome palette of white, gray, and the deep, dark green of the conifers. The silence deepened, becoming even more absolute. The snow isolated me completely, turning my 15-mile distance from Mark into an impassable barrier. My small cabin felt like the last bastion of warmth and light in an endless, frozen world, and it was with the snow that the strangeness began. It was a Tuesday morning, I remember, because I had just finished my weekly report for Mark, a pointless exercise now that no supply plane could get through. As I went to the kitchen window with my coffee, I saw them. Footprints. My first thought was an animal, of course. A fox, maybe, or a wolverine. But as my eyes focused, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. They weren't animal tracks. They were small, perfectly formed footprints like those of a child. And they were bare. I grabbed my heavy coat and boots, my heart hammering against my ribs. I circled the cabin, my scientific mind desperately trying to find a rational explanation. The prints were delicate, each toe clearly defined in the fresh powder. They formed a distinct, meandering path that led from the dense tree line, approached the cabin, and then circled it. They paused beneath each window, the kitchen, the living area, even the small bedroom window at the back. It was as if someone or something had spent the night slowly walking around my home, peering inside. The trail then led back into the woods and simply vanished, as if the walker had been plucked straight up into the sky. A child out here. It was impossible. No one lived for dozens of miles. No sane parent would let their child wander barefoot in sub-zero temperatures. I radioed Mark, my voice sounding thin and shaky even to my own ears. Mark, this is Chloe. Over. The radio crackled to life. Morning, Chloe. Everything all right up there? Over. I tried to keep my report clinical professional. I found a series of anomalous tracks around my cabin, humanoid but very small. Barefoot, they appeared overnight. Over. There was a long pause. I could hear the static hiss and pop. Barefoot, you say. Chloe, you're sure they're not from a marten or something? Sometimes the snow melts and refreezes in weird shapes. Wind can do strange things. Over. Mark, I'm looking right at them. I insisted, my frustration rising. I have a degree in environmental science. I know what animal tracks look like. These are bipedal, 5 toes and arch. They're footprints. Over. His sigh was audible even through the static. All right, rookie. Look, there's nobody out there. It's a ghost story. Probably just your mind playing tricks on you. Cabin fever can set in fast. Just keep an eye out, I guess. Try to stay busy. Mark out. The radio went silent, leaving me in the deafening quiet of the snow-covered landscape. Cabin fever. He thought I was going crazy. Maybe I was. I spent the rest of the day on edge, my shotgun leaning against the door. I tried to dismiss it, to believe Mark's explanation of melting snow or wind-blown debris. But when I looked out the window, the tiny, perfect footprints were still there, a silent, chilling testament to my nocturnal visitor. The next morning they were gone, covered by a fresh layer of snow. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. It was a fluke, I told myself, a one-time anomaly. But the morning after that they were back. A new set just as clear, just as deliberate, circling the cabin, pausing under the windows. This became my new reality. Every morning, I would wake with a sense of dread, and every morning, I would be greeted by the silent evidence that I was not alone. They never came closer than a few feet from the cabin walls, always keeping to the perimeter. I stopped reporting it to Mark. What was the point? He'd already dismissed me as a hysterical rookie. The isolation I had once cherished now felt like a trap. The profound silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, pregnant with unspoken threats. I started talking to myself just to fill the quiet. I'd leave the generator running all night, the hum a flimsy shield against the oppressive stillness. I began to feel watched constantly. The feeling was a physical weight on my shoulders, a prickling on the back of my neck. I would be reading by the fire and suddenly feel a compulsion to look at the window, half expecting to see a small, pale face peering in at me from the darkness. The wilderness was no longer my sanctuary. It had become my prison, and I was sharing it with something I couldn't see and didn't understand. 3 more weeks passed, each day a carbon copy of the last, each morning bringing a fresh torment of tiny footprints in the snow. The dread became a permanent resident in my gut. Sleep offered no escape. It was a shallow, restless state plagued by dreams of whispering voices just outside the range of hearing, and the sensation of cold fingers tracing the glass of my windows. I lost weight. Dark circles bloomed beneath my eyes, stark against my pale skin. I found myself jumping at every sound, the groan of the cabin settling, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the mournful sigh of the wind through the spruce trees. The line between rational fear and paranoia blurred until it was indistinguishable. I was a scientist trained to observe and analyze, but the data I collected each morning defied all logic. I was trapped in a cycle of silent, solitary madness. The break in the monotony came as a crackle over the satellite radio, a voice cutting through the static that had become my only companion. It was Mark, his tone stripped of its usual condescending calm and replaced with a clipped urgency. Al Stations, we have a code for. Missing person. Adult male, name of Arthur Wells. Experienced hunter, overdue by 48 hours. Last known location was a solo camp near the Tlaikila River Basin. A break in the weather is expected in the next 12 hours. We're mobilizing a search and rescue operation. Chloe, you're the closest ranger to his projected area. I need you to gear up and head to the coordinates of his base camp. Another team is mobilizing from the main station, but you can get there hours before us. Acknowledge. Over. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me, sharp and clean, momentarily purging the creeping dread. A missing hunter, this was real. This was a tangible problem I could focus on, a mission with a clear objective. It was a relief to have something to fear other than the phantom circling my cabin. Acknowledged. I replied, my voice steady. I'm gearing up now. We'll report upon arrival at the coordinates. Over. Stay sharp, Chloe. The weather window is tight. Mark out. Within 20 minutes, I was on my snowmobile. The roar of the engine, a welcome violence in the oppressive quiet. The machine cut through the deep powder, sending plumes of white into the frigid air. The 15-mile journey to the Tlaikila Basin was arduous, a weaving path through dense forest and across frozen streams. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about the footprints. I was focused on the task at hand, my mind running through survival scenarios, first aid protocols, and search patterns. I was a park ranger again, not a prisoner in a haunted cabin. I found the abandoned camp easily enough. It was tucked into a small clearing, sheltered from the wind by a thick stand of ancient hemlocks. A high-quality, four-season tent stood half collapsed under a fresh load of snow. A small, extinguished fire pit sat nearby, a blackened cooking pot resting on the grate. It was a scene of eerie stillness, a snapshot of a life abruptly paused. I dismounted and began my assessment, my training taking over. I moved with methodical purpose, documenting the scene. The tent flap was open, whipping gently in the breeze. Inside, a sleeping bag was unrolled but empty. A backpack lay open, its contents, spare clothes, a water filter, a first aid kit, partially spilled out. A half-eaten ration bar sat on a small folding stool, frozen solid. It was as if Arthur Wells had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of an animal attack. The only tracks visible were my own and the deep impressions left by Wells's heavy winter boots. They led away from the camp and into the trees, heading west. I followed them. The trail was clear at first, a straight, determined path. But as I moved deeper into the forest, the tracks began to meander. They weaved between trees, circled back on themselves, and sometimes stopped abruptly before starting again in a slightly different direction. It was confusing. It wasn't the path of an experienced hunter navigating his territory. It was the path of someone who was lost, disoriented. My radio crackled. Chloe, this is SAR Team 1. We're about an hour out from your position. Any sign of the subject? Over. SAR 1, this is Chloe. I responded, my breath pluming in the cold. I'm at the base camp. It's abandoned. I'm following a single set of tracks heading west, but the path is erratic. It looks like he was disoriented. Over. Roger that. Proceed with caution. We'll rendezvous at the camp. Out. I continued to follow the bewildering trail. The forest grew darker and more dense, the ancient trees blocking out what little light penetrated the heavy cloud cover. A profound sense of unease began to settle over me, displacing the earlier adrenaline. This place felt wrong. The silence here was different from the silence around my cabin. It was heavier, watchful. And then I saw it. In a small patch of snow, sheltered from the wind at the base of a gnarled, old-growth spruce was a single perfect footprint. It was small, delicate, and bare. My blood ran cold. I stopped dead, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It couldn't be. Not here. Not 10 miles from my cabin. I knelt, my gloved fingers hovering over the impossible track. It was identical to the ones that had been haunting me for weeks. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't cabin fever. This wasn't a trick of the light or melting snow. It was real, and it was here. The disoriented path of the hunter suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. He wasn't just lost, he was being led. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively going to the shotgun slung over my shoulder. The forest no longer felt empty. I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the same suffocating sensation I felt in my cabin, but magnified 100 times. The whispers I'd heard in my dreams seemed to echo in the rustling of the pine needles. I was standing in the middle of a nightmare that had suddenly become terrifyingly real. My radio blared to life, making me cry out in shock. All stations, this is SARE Team 2. We have located the subject. Repeat, we have located the subject. A wave of relief, quickly followed by dread. SARE 2, what is his condition? Over, Mark's voice commanded. There was a long, static-filled pause. The voice that came back was strange, shaken. He's deceased, Mark. Apparent suicide. He hanged himself from a low, hanging branch on a spruce tree. The words hit me like a physical blow. Hanged himself. I looked around at the dense forest, at the thousands of low, hanging branches heavy with snow. The voice on the radio continued, painting a grim picture. The location is bizarre. It's nearly 10 miles from his camp, in the opposite direction of his supposed hunting route. There's no way he could have gotten here by accident. It's like he walked in a straight line to this specific spot. My gaze fell back to the tiny, bare footprint at my feet. A straight line. My mind reeled, connecting the dots in a pattern of pure horror. The meandering tracks of the hunter, my own nightly visitors, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, and now this. A man lured 10 miles into the wilderness to his death. The footprints weren't a sign of a curious visitor. They were a predator's lure. The things that circled my cabin at night weren't just watching me. They were waiting. The journey back to my cabin was a blur of pure, unadulterated terror. The 10 miles from the hunter's last known position felt longer and more treacherous than any distance I had ever traveled. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a small, humanoid shape. The wind, whistling through the dense spruce and hemlock, carried phantom sounds that scraped at the edge of my hearing. The faint echo of a child's giggle, a sibilant whisper that seemed to form my name. The roar of my snowmobile's engine, once a comforting assertion of mechanical power, now felt like a desperate scream into a vast, predatory silence. I pushed the machine to its limits, my knuckles white on the handlebars, driven by a singular, primal need to get back behind a locked door, even though I knew with chilling certainty that the door offered no real protection. The things that had lured Arthur Wells to his death were the same things that danced outside my windows every night. I wasn't safe. I was just their next project. When I finally burst through the door of my cabin, I didn't even bother to take off my heavy gear. I slammed the door, bolted it, and leaned against the thick wood, gasping for breath as if I'd been running for my life. My eyes darted to the windows. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of orange and purple, beautiful but menacing. Soon, the darkness would come, and with it my visitors. The shotgun felt like a child's toy in my hands. How do you shoot a whisper? How do you kill a footprint? The radio crackled again. It was Mark. Chloe, the teams are heading back to the main station with Wells. The weather's turning. I want you out of that cabin. Now, pack a bag. I'm coming to get you. We'll meet at the halfway point. Over. For the first time, I heard something other than annoyance in his voice. It was concern. Genuine human concern. The official report would read suicide, but everyone who had been out there, who had seen the bizarre location of the body 10 miles from camp, felt the wrongness of it. They couldn't explain it, but they could feel it. Relief washed over me so intensely that my knees buckled. I wouldn't have to spend another night here. I wouldn't have to lie awake, listening for the soft crunch of snow under tiny, bare feet. The rendezvous with Mark was a tense, mostly silent affair. He took one look at my face, the wild, haunted look in my eyes, the tremor in my hands, and seemed to decide against any questions. The ride back to the main station was a long one. I felt a profound sense of shame mixed with my fear. I was a scientist, a ranger. I was supposed to be rational, grounded. But I was fleeing from what my mind could only label as ghosts. The main station was a hub of somber activity. The other rangers, tough and seasoned men and women, moved with a quiet gravity. They'd seen death before, but this was different. It was inexplicable, and the unknown breeds a special kind of fear, I was sitting in the small common area, nursing a mug of hot coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, when an old man I'd only seen a few times before approached me. He was one of the station's maintenance workers, a local Ute man named Samuel. He was short and stout, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, his dark eyes holding a wisdom that felt ancient. He moved silently and sat in the chair across from me. He didn't speak for a long time, just looked at me. It wasn't an invasive stare, but a knowing one. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. You saw them, didn't you? He finally asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I didn't have to ask what he meant. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The little footprints, he continued, his gaze unwavering, around your cabin. In the snow, tears welled to my eyes, tears of fear, but also a validation I wasn't crazy. Someone else knew. Someone else understood. What are they? I whispered, the words barely audible. Samuel leaned forward, his expression turning grim. He lowered his voice, as if afraid of being overheard, not by the other rangers, but by the forest itself. My grandmother told me the stories when I was a boy to keep me from wandering too far into the woods. She said the land is spirits. Not all of them are kind. The ones you saw, we call them the Arsenrit. The name felt alien on his tongue, a word from a world far older than science and Park Service regulations. They are not ghosts of the dead. He explained patiently, as if teaching a child a fundamental, dangerous truth. They have always been here. They look like children, but they are not children. They are ancient, territorial, and cruel. They see our cabins, our trails, our very presence as an invasion, a trespass. Everything he said resonated with a terrifying clarity. The footprints around my cabin, always near the windows, as if studying the invader. They play with people, Samuel went on, his eyes distant, as if seeing things I couldn't. They are drawn to those who are alone. They start small, whispers on the wind, sounds you can't quite place. They want to unbalance you, to make you doubt your own mind. Cabin fever, Mark had called it. But it wasn't my mind that was sick, it was being deliberately poisoned. When they grow bored, or when someone angers them by staying too long, they become more direct. They mislead lost travelers. That hunter, Samuel shook his head slowly. It wasn't just lost, the Arsenrit led him. They would have whispered to him, made him hear familiar voices, promised him safety. They would have guided his every step, leading him deeper and deeper into their territory, turning him around until he was completely disoriented and exhausted. My blood turned to ice as I remembered the hunter's meandering tracks and the single, bare footprint I had found. It was a lure, a breadcrumb trail laid by monsters. And then Samuel's voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper, his eyes filled with a deep ancestral fear. When they have broken you, when you are filled with despair, they do their worst. They convince you to do it. They don't have to touch you. They just whisper the idea. They hang their victims from the low branches of trees, and they stay to watch. They mock them as they die, their laughter sounding like the rustling of leaves or the cracking of ice. A strangled sob escaped my lips. The image was too horrific, too vivid. Arthur Wells, alone in the dark, tormented by whispering, childlike demons until he took his own life, all for their cruel amusement. I left Lake Clark National Park 2 days later on the first available supply plane. I didn't say goodbye to anyone but Samuel. He simply nodded when I told him I was leaving, his eyes saying, "You are wise to go." Mark tried to talk me out of it, speaking of post-traumatic stress and counseling. He couldn't understand. He lived in a world of rules and reports, of things that could be measured and explained. I had seen behind that curtain into an older, wilder world governed by forces that defied explanation. I never went back to the wilderness. The silence I once craved is now something I fear. Sometimes in the dead of night, even in the heart of the city, I think I can hear faint whispers on the wind. I will never forget the tiny, bare footprints in the snow, or the profound, chilling truth that some places in this world do not belong to us, and when we trespass, we do so at our own peril. The Arsenrit are still there, in the deep, silent woods of Alaska, dancing in the snow and waiting for the next lonely soul to wander into their territory. My name is David, and for 7 years my office was the largest known cave system on Earth. I was a park ranger and guide at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, a place that holds more than 400 miles of surveyed passageways. To call it a labyrinth is an understatement. It's a subterranean world, a kingdom of geological titans in absolute, primordial darkness. Most people who visit see it as a geological wonder, a testament to the patient, relentless power of water carving through limestone over millions of years. They see the soaring domes, the vast chambers that could swallow cathedrals, the delicate gypsum flowers that bloom in eternal night. They see the history, the adventure. I saw all that too, but I also saw the other side of it. The profound, unnerving silence and the kind of darkness that feels like a physical weight against your skin. Being a guide there isn't just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about being a shepherd in the underworld. You are responsible for the safety, and more importantly, the sanity of the dozens of people who follow your light into the belly of the earth. You learn to read faces in the dim glow of the electric lamps. You see the initial awe turn to nervous excitement, and in some, a creeping dread. The cave has a way of getting into your head. The air is different, cool, heavy, and smelling of damp earth and stone. The silence between your spoken words is deeper than any silence on the surface. It's a void. When we'd perform the traditional demonstration of turning off all the lights to show them true, total darkness, the reaction was always the same. A collective gasp, a few nervous giggles, and then a heavy, anxious stillness. You could feel the group pressing closer together, their modern sensibilities clashing with a primal fear that's been hardwired into our DNA since the dawn of time. They were always relieved when the lights flickered back on. For me, that darkness became a familiar colleague, a constant presence I had to respect. Of all the tours we offered, the one that delved into the park's more macabre history always left the deepest impression. It was the tour that led visitors to the remnants of a failed 19th century experiment, a subterranean tuberculosis sanatorium. In the 1840s, a physician named Dr. John Croghan bought the cave. He was convinced that the constant, cool temperature and the purified cave air held the cure for consumption, the devastating disease we now know as tuberculosis. He built a small, grim village deep within the cave, constructing a dozen simple stone and wooden huts for his patients. He brought them down here, into the darkness, believing he was leading them to salvation. It was, in every sense, a catastrophic failure. The environment was the opposite of curative. The perpetual dampness and darkness, the smoke from the lard oil lamps they used for light, and the isolation from the sun and fresh air only worsened their conditions. Their lungs, already ravaged by the disease, filled with smoke and moisture. They wasted away in the oppressive gloom, their desperate hopes dissolving into the cold, silent stone. Within a year, they were all dead. Dr. Croghan himself, who also suffered from the disease, eventually succumbed, his grand experiment turning into his tomb. Leading people through this section of the cave was always a somber affair. You could feel the atmosphere shift the moment you entered the area known as Star Chamber and approached the huts. The main passageway widens here, and set back from the path are the two remaining stone huts, looking like ancient, forgotten tombs. They are simple, bleak structures, little more than 4 stone walls with gaping, empty doorways. You don't need to be a psychic to feel the weight of the suffering that soaked into this place. I would tell the story of Dr. Croghan and his patients, my voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. Visitors would fall silent, their eyes fixed on the dark, empty entrances to the huts. They'd imagine the sick, the dying lying on cots in the eternal twilight, listening to the slow drip of water, their world reduced to a few feet of stone and shadow. The story always got the most visceral reaction. People would shiver, pull their jackets tighter, and cast nervous glances into the black maw of the huts, as if expecting to see a spectral patient staring back. I had become accustomed to the legends, the ghost stories that naturally spring from such a place. We guides would often joke about them, swapping tales of strange echoes, fleeting shadows, and the disembodied whispers that some claimed to hear. The most persistent legend was that of the coughing man, the ghost of a patient, forever trapped, forever suffering, his wet, ragged cough echoing through the passages. It was a good story, a chilling piece of folklore to enhance the tour, but I never put any real stock in it. I was a man of science and geology, of map passages and safety protocols. I'd spent thousands of hours underground and had never seen or heard anything I couldn't explain. That changed on a cold evening in late October. The park was quieter as the tourist season wound down. I was leading the last tour of the day, a smaller, more intimate group. They were captivated by the sanatorium story, asking more questions than usual, lingering longer by the stone huts. By the time we ascended back to the surface world, dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My duties weren't over. One of the final tasks for a guide is to do a sweep of the tour route, to walk it one last time to ensure no one has wandered off or stayed behind, and to make sure all the lights are off. It was a routine I had done hundreds of times. I told my colleagues I was heading back in for the final sweep, grabbed my high-powered headlamp, and descended once more into the familiar quiet. The electric lights along the path were already off, so the cave was mine, illuminated only by the bright beam on my helmet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel path and the distant, rhythmic drip of water. It was peaceful. I felt at home. I made my way through the winding passages, past the giant's coffin, through the tight squeeze of Fat Man's misery, until I reached the sanatorium area. I did a quick check, shining my light into the two stone huts, confirming they were as empty as they had been for over 150 years. I swept my beam across the path and the surrounding rock walls. All clear. I turned to head back, my thoughts already on a warm meal and a soft bed. That's when the world trembled. It wasn't a loud, explosive sound at first. It was a deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The ground beneath my feet vibrated violently, and the air was instantly filled with a deafening roar. It was a sound of immense pressure and unstoppable force, of rock grinding against rock. I instinctively dropped to the ground, covering my head as dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The roar was cataclysmic, echoing and amplifying through the passages until it was all that existed. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then silence, a silence more profound and terrifying than any I'd ever experienced. It was heavy, ringing in my ears. I slowly pushed myself up, my heart hammering against my ribs. My light cut a nervous path through the thick, swirling dust. I was alive, unhurt. But when I shined my beam down the passage I had just come from, my blood ran cold. The way was gone. Where there had been a wide, familiar path, there was now a solid wall of rock. A massive, chaotic jumble of limestone boulders, some the size of cars, was wedged from floor to ceiling, completely and utterly sealing the passage. A rock slide, a major one. My exit, my only known way back to the surface, was buried under tons of rock. My heart sank. I was trapped. For a long moment, I just stood there frozen, the beam of my headlamp fixed on the wall of rubble that had once been a path. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. Rock slides of this magnitude were rare, almost unheard of on the established tour routes. The Park Service was meticulous about safety, about checking for geological instability. But the tons of rock piled before me were an undeniable, terrifying truth. I was trapped. My training kicked in, a welcome anchor in a tidal wave of panic. The first rule in any emergency is to not make it worse. Don't panic. Assess the situation. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air scraping my throat, and forced myself into a state of professional calm. I was a park ranger. I had protocols for this. First, the radio. I unclipped the heavy-duty radio from my belt. Ranger Station, this is Ranger Miller. Do you copy? I asked, my voice sounding small and thin in the vast chamber. Only static. I wasn't surprised. We were deep, and radio signals were notoriously unreliable this far underground. Still, the silence from the speaker felt like another shovel of dirt on my coffin. I tried again. Ranger Station, this is David Miller. I have an emergency situation. I am trapped by a rock slide on the historic tour route near the sanatorium huts. Do you read me? Over. The response was the same empty hiss. Next, I checked my gear. My headlamp was fully charged, good for at least another 24 hours of continuous use if I was careful. I had a backup light in my small pack, along with 2 bottles of water, a couple of energy bars, and a standard first aid kit. Not much, but it would be enough. They knew I was down here. They knew my route. When I didn't report back from my sweep, they'd come looking. A rescue operation would be launched. All I had to do was wait. Wait. The word echoed in the silence. Waiting on the surface is one thing. You have the sun, the moon, the passage of time marked by a changing sky. In the cave, time is meaningless. There is only the eternal, unchanging dark. Waiting here meant surrendering to the void. I approached the rockfall, shining my light over the massive boulders. It was a solid, interlocking mess. There were no gaps, no crevices large enough for a person to squeeze through. Trying to climb it would be suicide. The whole thing was unstable, and the slightest shift could bring more rock crashing down. My only option was to back away and find a safe place to wait for rescue. The most logical place was right where I was, the chamber containing the 2 remaining sanatorium huts. It was the largest, most stable open area nearby, and it was a known landmark on the map. This is where they would expect to find me. I retreated from the rockfall, putting a safe distance between myself and the unstable pile, and found a relatively flat, dry spot on the path, not far from the huts. I sat down, leaning my back against a cold, smooth section of the cave wall. And then I waited. The first hour was a test of discipline. I fought the urge to keep checking my radio, to pace back and forth. I made myself take small, measured sips of water. I ate half an energy bar, chewing slowly, making it last. I kept my mind busy by cataloging the sounds of the cave. There was the slow, metronomic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from a stalactite somewhere off in the darkness. There was the soft whisper of my own breathing, and beneath it all, a low, almost sub-audible hum. The sound of millions of tons of earth pressing down from above. As the second hour bled into the third, the profound isolation began to work on me. The darkness outside the small circle of my headlamp wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a presence. It was heavy, suffocating. I kept thinking I saw movement at the edge of my vision, fleeting shadows that would vanish the moment I turned my head to look. I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me, the prisoner's cinema, effect that can happen in sensory deprivation. I told myself that, but the rational explanation did little to calm the primal fear that was beginning to prickle at the back of my neck. I decided to turn off my headlamp to conserve the battery. I'd turn it on for a few minutes every half hour or so. I clicked the button, and the world vanished. The darkness was absolute, a physical thing that pressed against my eyeballs. The silence rushed in to fill the void, and suddenly the dripping water sounded as loud as a hammer blow. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum in my ears. I couldn't stand it. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 5 minutes, I fumbled for the switch and flooded my small section of the world with light again. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I decided to leave the light on. It was sometime during the 4th or 5th hour. I was losing track, that I heard the first sound that wasn't me and wasn't the cave. It was a soft, scraping noise. Scrup. It sounded like a boot dragging on the gravel path. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. Was someone there? Silence. The only answer was the steady drip of water. My mind raced. Was it another ranger? A tourist who had somehow gotten lost? Or was it just a rock settling? That had to be it. The cave was still settling after the rock slide. I took a deep breath and forced myself to relax. It was just a rock. I sat for another hour, straining my ears, my head on a constant swivel. Nothing. The scraping sound didn't repeat. The fear slowly subsided, leaving a residue of unease. I was starting to feel the exhaustion, the mental and physical toll of the situation. My eyelids felt heavy. I knew I shouldn't sleep, but the temptation was immense. And then I heard it. It started softly, almost lost beneath the sound of the dripping water. A sound so unexpected, so human, and so utterly out of place that my brain couldn't immediately identify it. It was a wet, guttural, catching sound. My eyes snapped open wide. I stopped breathing, listening. There it was again, louder this time, clearer. It was a cough. But it wasn't a normal cough. It was a deep, ragged, painful sound, thick with fluid. It was the sound of lungs that were shredded and drowning. It was a sound of profound sickness and suffering. And it was coming from inside one of the stone huts. The legend of the coughing man slammed into the forefront of my mind. The ghost story I'd told to tourists hundreds of times. The folklore I'd dismissed as a silly tale to spook the visitors. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. This can't be happening. My mind is breaking. I'm hallucinating. The coughing fit continued, a desperate, agonizing sequence of sounds that seemed to have no end. It was so real, so present. I could almost feel the vibration of it in the air. It was the sound of a man in his death throes. My scientific, rational mind fought a losing battle against the terror. It had to be an animal, a sick raccoon or a bat. No animal on earth makes a sound like that. It was unmistakably human. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. My legs felt like lead. I had to know. I had to see. Even if it was the last thing I ever saw, I had to know what was making that noise. My headlamp beam trembled as I pointed it toward the nearest hut, the source of the sound. The entrance was a rectangle of perfect, impenetrable black. "Who's in there?" I managed to call out, my voice a hoarse whisper. The coughing stopped, instantly. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise it replaced. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my light trained on the empty doorway. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the frantic pounding in my chest and the lonely drip, drip, drip of the water. Then, from the darkness within the hut, a new sound emerged. a soft, wet, shuffling noise, and a faint, spectral figure began to glide out of the blackness. It didn't walk, it glided. The figure that emerged from the absolute black of the hut doorway moved with an unnatural smoothness, its feet never seeming to touch the gravel path. My headlamp beam, which should have illuminated it fully, seemed to pass partially through it. It was a man, or the shimmering outline of one, dressed in clothes from another century. He wore a simple, dark waistcoat over a collarless shirt, and trousers that were baggy and worn. His form was faint, a watercolor painting of a person rendered in smoke and pale moonlight. His face was gaunt, with hollowed-out cheeks and deep, set eyes that were dark, empty pits of despair. His transparency was the most unnerving part. I could see the rough stone wall of the hut right through his chest. My mind, which had been scrambling for any rational explanation, a trick of the light, a stress-induced hallucination, simply shut down. The part of my brain responsible for logic and reason went silent, overwhelmed by the primal, screaming terror of a prey animal facing its predator. I was no longer David Miller, park ranger. I was just a creature trapped in the dark with something impossible. The figure seemed oblivious to me. It drifted from the doorway of the first hut and began to move slowly towards the second, its path taking it directly across the main trail. It was then that the coughing started again. It wasn't just a sound coming from him. His entire spectral form seemed to convulse with each racking hack. His shoulders would hunch, his body would bend, and that terrible wet, tearing sound would fill the chamber, echoing off the ancient stone. It was the sound of a body destroying itself from the inside out, a sound of pure, unending agony. He was trapped in an eternal loop of his own death throes. I took a step back, my boots scraping loudly on the gravel. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence between coughs. The figure stopped. Its head, which had been bowed in its suffering, slowly lifted. The dark, empty sockets of its eyes fixed on me. There was no malice in its gaze, no anger. There was only a vast, empty, bottomless well of misery. It saw me. For the first time, I was sure of it. It wasn't just a residual haunting, a memory imprinted on the stone. It was aware, and it was aware that I was watching it suffer. Then it began to move towards me. It wasn't a charge or a lunge. It was the same slow, inexorable glide. It raised a hand, a faint, pale, semi-transparent thing, and reached out. Was it a threat, a plea? I didn't know, and I wasn't going to wait to find out. My survival instinct, raw and absolute, took over. I turned and scrambled backward, my feet tangling beneath me. I fell hard onto the path, the impact jarring my teeth. My headlamp beam shot wildly around the chamber, painting strobing, nightmarish scenes across the walls. The gaping maw of the hut, the glistening stalactites, the shimmering, advancing form of the ghost. Stay back. I screamed, my voice a pathetic, cracking squeak. I fumbled in my pack, my fingers closing around the smooth plastic of a water bottle. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw it with all my might. It flew end over end, a perfect spiral, and passed directly through the center of the figure's chest without slowing down. It clattered loudly against the rock wall somewhere in the darkness behind him. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't pause. It just kept coming, its hand outstretched, the coughing growing louder, more desperate, as if my presence was somehow intensifying its pain. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were frozen. This was it. This was how I died. Not from the rock slide, not from starvation, but at the hands of a 150-year-old ghost. I wouldn't be a body they found, I'd be a story, another legend whispered on the tours. The ranger who went mad in the dark. No, a final, defiant spark of survival ignited in me. I couldn't go back the way I came. The path to the surface was blocked by the rockfall, and now by this thing. My only other option was to go forward, deeper into the cave, past the sanatorium and into the unlit, unmapped passages beyond the official tour route. It was a choice between a known horror and an unknown darkness. I chose the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran blindly, away from the huts, my headlamp beam cutting a frantic, bouncing tunnel through the pitch black passage ahead. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound was all I needed. The wet, ragged coughing was right behind me, echoing through the narrow passage, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was in my head, a virus of sound. The path here was rough, uneven. I stumbled, caught myself, and kept running, my ankles twisting on loose rocks. My only thought was to put distance between myself and that sound. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. Then my foot caught on an outcropping of rock. I pitched forward, my arms flailing, and my helmeted head slammed into the stone floor with a sickening crack. The world exploded in a flash of white, and then nothing. darkness. My headlamp was destroyed. The silence was absolute. The coughing was gone. I was alone. Utterly, completely, and blindly alone in the heart of the earth. I don't know how long I lay there. Time had ceased to exist. I drifted in a state of terrified delirium. Every drip of water was a footstep. Every rush of air was a ghostly whisper. I curled into a fetal position on the cold stone floor, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for the coughing to start again, waiting for a cold, transparent hand to touch my shoulder. I had given up. I was just waiting to die. The voices came later, much later. At first, I was sure I was imagining them. Faint, distant shouts. "David! Ranger Miller! Can you hear us?" It was another trick of the dark, my dying brain conjuring the sounds of rescue. I didn't answer. I didn't have the energy. But the voices grew louder, more distinct. And then a light. A beautiful, brilliant, wonderful beam of light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the passage. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. "We've got him! Over here!" The rescue team found me huddled on the ground, covered in dust, babbling incoherently about a coughing man. They wrapped me in a thermal blanket, gave me water, and told me everything was going to be okay. They had been searching for hours, finally finding an old, seldom used connecting passage that bypassed the main rock slide. As they led me back towards the surface, we had to pass the sanatorium. I couldn't help but look. In the combined, powerful beams of their lights, the chamber was just a chamber. The stone huts were just empty, historical structures. There was no ghost. There was no sound but our own footsteps and the steady drip of water. One of the rescuers, a man named Frank, put a hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, son," he said gently. "The dark plays tricks on you down here, especially after a shock like that." I didn't argue. I just nodded and let them lead me out into the cool, clean air of the night. I never went back into Mammoth Cave. I submitted my resignation the very next morning. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the shepherd in the underworld anymore, not after seeing one of its true inhabitants. I moved away from Kentucky. I tried to leave the memory of that night buried deep in the limestone, but it didn't stay. It followed me. There are nights, even now, years later, when I wake up in a cold sweat. In the dead silence of my safe, suburban home, I can almost hear it, a faint, distant echo from deep underground, the wet, ragged, and eternal cough of a man who never left the dark. My name is Eleanor Vance, though most people who knew me back then just called me Ranger Vance. Before I became a name whispered in online forums and a footnote in a handful of cryptic missing person files, I was a federal employee with the National Park Service. My post was Joshua Tree National Park, a sprawling expanse of surreal landscapes where the Mojave and Colorado deserts collide. To most, it's a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. To me, it became a place of profound and unsettling dread. I didn't seek out a career as a park ranger for the thrill of it. I wasn't an adrenaline junkie or a wannabe law enforcement officer. I came to the desert seeking a different kind of quiet. I'd spent my early 20s in Los Angeles, a city that hums with a frantic, man-made energy that never ceases. The noise, the people, the relentless pressure to be someone that had worn me down to a raw nerve. The desert was my antidote. Its silence was vast and ancient, a silence that felt heavier and more meaningful than the mere absence of sound. It was a silence that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful, and in a way, that's what I wanted. My training was extensive and grounded in logic. I could identify dozens of species of flora and fauna, track a mountain lion from a partial print, read a topographical map like it was a novel, and provide emergency medical care with limited resources. We were taught to be rational observers, to deconstruct every situation into a set of known variables. A strange noise was a coyote pack yipping in a canyon, its call distorted by the wind. A flicker of movement was a kit fox darting between rocks. Every mystery had a logical, natural explanation. That was the doctrine, and for the first few years, I believed in it completely. I saw the desert as a complex but ultimately understandable system. I was wrong. The desert has its own brand of weird. It's a fact that every seasoned ranger tacitly accepts. You hear stories from the old-timers, tales told over lukewarm coffee at the ranger station before the sun bakes the world into a shimmering haze. They talk about the desert lights, strange orbs that dance on the horizon with no apparent source. They talk about hikers who walk off a well, mark trail for a moment, and are found days later, miles away, dehydrated and with no memory of how they got there. And there are whispers, older stories that connect to the local tribes, the Cahuilla and the Serrano people, who have lived in this land for centuries. Their stories aren't just about strange lights, they're about beings, entities that belong to the desert in a way we never could. We, the uniformed outsiders, would nod along, smile, and file these tales away under desert folklore. It was easier than confronting the alternative. My own confrontation with that alternative began on a sweltering evening in late July. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The heat of the day still radiated up from the ground, but the air was beginning to carry the first hints of the desert's nocturnal chill. I was finishing up my patrol, my thoughts already turning to a hot meal and a soft bed, when the radio on my dashboard crackled to life. Dispatch to 7 Echo 3, the voice of my supervisor, a gruff but fair man named Henderson, cut through the static. 7 Echo 3, this is Vance. Go ahead, I replied, my hand resting on the receiver. Eleanor got a call from some campers out by the Cottonwood Spring area. A family. They sound pretty rattled. Reporting some unusual vocalizations. Deep, guttural cries, they said. All night long, they're packing up now, but the father wants to make a report in person. Says he found something. My initial reaction was a familiar blend of wariness and professional curiosity. Unusual vocalizations could mean anything. A bobcat's scream can sound eerily human. A large owl can produce some deeply unsettling hoots. Probably just some city folk not used to the local choir. I muttered to myself. Copy that, dispatch, I said into the radio. I'm about 20 minutes out. I'll head over and take their statement. Vance out. The drive to the campsite was unnerving in a way that's hard to describe. As twilight deepened into true night, the familiar landscape transformed. The Joshua trees with their gnarled, reaching limbs ceased to be plants. In the sweeping beam of my headlights, they became a silent crowd of twisted, humanoid figures, their spiky leaves like coarse hair standing on end. The shadows they cast were long and distorted, dancing and writhing as my truck bounced along the unpaved service road. The silence I had once found so comforting now felt oppressive, watchful. When I arrived, the scene was exactly as I'd pictured, yet charged with an energy that set my teeth on edge. A rented RV was parked haphazardly, its engine running and its headlights cutting a bright, desperate swath through the darkness. A man, presumably the father, stood by the driver's side door, his face pale and slick with sweat in the harsh light. A woman was ushering 2 small children into the vehicle, their faces buried in her sides. Their supplies were scattered around the remnants of a campfire, a knocked-over cooler, a child's toy lying half. Buried in the sand, a camp chair on its side. It was a scene of hasty, panicked retreat. I parked my truck, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the area, and walked towards the man. I'm Ranger Vance, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. You're the one who called. He nodded, his eyes wide and darting towards the impenetrable darkness that surrounded our little bubble of light. Thank God you're here. He stammered. We heard it all night. It wasn't an animal. Not like any animal I've ever heard. It was deep, like rocks grinding together in a throat. And it was big. We could feel it, the weight of it, when it moved. He explained how the sounds had circled their campsite, always staying just beyond the reach of their firelight. They'd thrown more wood on the fire, trying to keep the darkness at bay, but the sounds only grew bolder, closer. Finally, just after dusk, something had entered their camp. They didn't see it, but they heard the heavy thud of the cooler being knocked over, followed by a low, guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. That was the final straw. I just wanted to get my family out of here, he said, his voice cracking. But before we packed up, I saw this. He pointed a shaky finger towards the edge of the campsite. I was checking the area with my flashlight. The tracks, they start over there. Following his direction, I retrieved my high-powered flashlight from my belt and began a systematic sweep of the ground. The desert floor was a mixture of sand and hard sun, baked earth. And there they were. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen thousands of tracks in my career. Coyote, deer, bighorn sheep, mountain lion. I'd even seen the occasional print left by a lost hiker. These were none of those. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. They were bipedal, the stride long and impossibly powerful. The impression was deep, suggesting immense weight. But it was the shape that stopped my heart. It was vaguely humanoid, but the toes were too long and splayed, the heel too broad, and there was no discernible arch. It was the footprint of something that walked like a man but was built like a monster. A cold dread, entirely separate from the night air, washed over me. This was not a known animal. This was not a prank. The depth of the prints, the sheer biological wrongness of their shape, it was terrifyingly real. My training, my logic, my entire rational framework began to crumble. I followed the trail, my flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand. One print, then another leading away from the scattered supplies. My mind, desperately trying to find a logical anchor, expected the trail to lead out into the open desert towards the rocky hills or a dry wash. That would make a strange kind of sense. But it didn't. The tracks led directly, unerringly, into a dense, ancient grove of Joshua trees just beyond the campsite. A tangled thicket where the trees grew so close together their twisted forms were almost impassable. The trail didn't go around it. It went into it. As I stood there, pointing my light into the black void between those gnarled, silent observers, a single, horrifying thought took root in my mind. It wasn't just hiding among the trees. It looked like them. I slowly lowered my flashlight. The father was watching me, his face a mask of fear, waiting for an explanation I couldn't give. The local tribes have stories, the old-timers had said. Stories of the Yucca Man, a hairy giant that hides among the trees. I filed the report later that night as unidentified animal activity, possible bear, a lie to maintain the fragile veneer of order. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I would never patrol that part of the park alone again. The desert had shown me its true face, and I understood that some things are not meant to be understood. They are only meant to be survived. The weeks following the incident at Cottonwood Spring were a quiet, simmering hell. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still wore the same uniform, drove the same truck, and patrolled the same sun-scorched landscapes. But beneath that veneer of routine, a fundamental shift had occurred. The desert silence I once craved now felt menacing, filled with unspoken threats. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, every gust of wind through the rocks sounded like a guttural whisper. The Joshua trees, my former silent companions, had become a jury of grotesque, watching figures. I had seen the devil's footprints, and now I saw his shadow everywhere. Sleep offered little escape. I was plagued by dreams of immense, hairy figures moving just at the edge of my vision, of deep, set eyes watching me from the impenetrable darkness of the grove. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of the ground vibrating from a heavy footfall still tingling in my bones. I threw myself into my work, hoping that physical exhaustion would grant me a dreamless night, but the fear was a parasite that had burrowed too deep. I started drinking more than I should, the sharp burn of whiskey the only thing that could temporarily dull the jagged edges of my anxiety. My supervisor, Henderson, noticed the change. He saw the dark circles under my eyes and the slight tremor in my hands as I sipped my morning coffee. "You're running yourself ragged. Vance," he said one morning, his tone a mixture of concern and command. "Take a few days off, go back to the city, decompress." I knew he meant well, but the thought of returning to the frantic energy of Los Angeles was now as terrifying as staying. The city was a cage of concrete and noise. The desert was a cage of silence and space. I was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. I avoided the Cottonwood Spring area like it was a radioactive zone. Whenever a call came in from that sector, I'd find an excuse, claiming I was on the other side of the park or low on fuel. The other rangers ribbed me about it, but I didn't care. Let them think I was lazy or spooked by coyotes. It was better than trying to explain the truth, a truth that I myself was struggling to accept. How do you tell your colleagues, people grounded in science and logic, that you believe a monster from local folklore is real? I had filed the official report, a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, family disturbed by suspected bear activity. Investigated site, found unidentifiable tracks, advised campers on proper food storage. It was a lie that protected my career, but it felt like a betrayal of my own sanity. Then in mid-August, when the heat was at its most oppressive and the memory of the tracks had begun to feel more like a fever dream than a real event, the call came. It wasn't a panicked cry from spooked campers. It was a calm, procedural report from dispatch. A vehicle had been found abandoned in a parking area near the trailhead for the Lost Palms Oasis. The owner, a 24-year-old solo hiker named Julian Croft, was 3 days overdue. His emergency contact, his sister, had reported him missing. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The Lost Palms Oasis trailhead was less than 2 miles from the Cottonwood Spring Grove. A full-scale search and rescue operation was launched immediately. It was an impressive display of efficiency and resources. Teams of rangers and volunteers were organized into grid search patterns. A helicopter buzzed overhead, its blades chopping through the thick, hot air. A cane unit was brought in, 2 German shepherds with a reputation for finding needles in haystacks. I was assigned to one of the ground teams, a grim-faced group of 4 rangers led by a seasoned veteran named Marcus. There was no way to avoid it this time. I had to go back. As we drove towards the search area, the familiar dread washed over me, colder and more intense than ever before. This wasn't about strange noises anymore. This was a missing person. A young man full of life had walked into this landscape and vanished. The official theory was predictable. He'd gotten lost, succumbed to dehydration, or perhaps fallen and injured himself in a remote canyon. These were the logical, tragic possibilities. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that none of them were true. He hadn't gotten lost. He had been taken. The search began. We fanned out, our eyes scanning the ground for any sign: a footprint, a dropped water bottle, a piece of torn clothing. The sun was relentless, beating down on us with a physical force. The heat shimmered off the rocks, making the distant landscape warp and tremble. For hours, we found nothing. The desert seemed to have swallowed Julian Croft whole, leaving not a single trace behind. The canine unit arrived mid-afternoon. The handlers brought the dogs to Julian's car, letting them get his scent from a T-shirt left on the passenger seat. The dogs, eager and focused, immediately picked up a trail leading away from the parking lot directly onto the designated path. We followed at a distance, a sense of cautious optimism rippling through the search party. The trail led steadily on for about a mile, and then the dogs stopped. They were at a junction where the main trail continued onward, but a smaller, less defined path branched off towards the west, in the direction of the Cottonwood Spring Grove. The dogs became agitated. They whined, their ears flat against their heads. They paced back and forth, sniffing the air, but they refused to take the western path. One of the handlers tried to coax his dog forward, but the animal dug its paws into the sand, pulling back on its leash with a low, guttural growl, a sound that was eerily reminiscent of the noises the family had described. "Never seen them like this," the handler said, shaking his head in confusion. "It's like there's a wall there, something they're terrified of." The search command, relying on logic, decided the dogs must have lost the scent. They redirected the teams to continue along the main trail deeper into the Osis Canyon. But I knew the dogs weren't wrong. They had smelled death, or something worse, and their primal instincts screamed at them to flee. The official search was called off as darkness fell, with plans to resume at dawn. The volunteers and most of the rangers headed back to the station. I told Marcus I wanted to check a small canyon we had passed earlier, a lie that came to my lips with practiced ease. He just nodded, too tired to argue. I watched them leave, their taillights shrinking into red pinpricks in the vast darkness, until I was alone, utterly alone. With a pounding heart, I turned my truck onto the service road that led towards the grove. This was madness. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive in the opposite direction, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. But the image of Julian Croft's face, taken from his driver's license photo, and now plastered on a missing person flyer, was burned into my mind. I had filed a lie. I had stayed silent. And now a man was gone. I felt a crushing weight of responsibility. I parked my truck a quarter-mile from the grove and walked the rest of the way, my heavy-duty flashlight cutting a nervous path through the night. The air grew colder as I approached, a damp, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no rustling lizards, no distant coyote calls. It was the silence of a tomb. I found the tracks from the first incident, faded but still visible in the moonlight, and alongside them, newer prints, the same monstrous bipedal tracks. And next to them, for a few horrifying yards, were the distinct prints of hiking boots. Julian's prints. They walked side by side, leading directly into the black, tangled heart of the grove. The boot prints were frantic, scuffed, the stride uneven. The other prints were steady, relentless, powerful. Steeling myself, I stepped into the grove. It was like entering another world. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. My flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, unable to penetrate more than a few feet. The gnarled Joshua trees crowded in around me, their spiky limbs reaching like skeletal fingers. I found his backpack first. It was torn open, its contents, energy bars, a map, a first aid kit, strewn across the ground. A little further in, I found his camera. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. I turned it on. The screen flickered to life. There were dozens of photos of the landscape, beautiful, serene shots of the desert. I scrolled to the last few images. The first was a blurry, panicked shot of the inside of the grove. The next was a close-up of a Joshua tree, but something was wrong with the bark. It looked fibrous, hairy. The final photo was almost complete blackness, but in the corner, illuminated by the camera's flash, were 2 points of light, 2 eyes. They glowed with a faint, self-possessed light, like embers in a dying fire. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. My light beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but a wall of twisted trees. But I had heard it. I wasn't alone. "Hello," I called out, my voice a pathetic squeak. "Julian?" Silence. Then a new sound, a low, guttural click, and it was coming from all around me, a ventriloquist trick of sound that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. It was the sound of something tasting the air. Something hungry. I began to back away, my eyes darting into the oppressive darkness. And then I saw it. For a split second, one of the trees in my peripheral vision moved. It wasn't the wind. It was a deliberate, fluid shift, a hulking shape detaching itself from the others. It was taller than a man, broader, its form a nightmarish parody of the plants it hid among. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my lungs, a solid block of ice. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, thorns and sharp leaves tearing at my clothes and skin, not daring to look back. The clicking sound was behind me, closer now, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic thud of immense feet on the desert floor. It wasn't running. It was pacing me. It was enjoying the chase. I burst out of the grove, gasping for air, and sprinted towards the distant light of my truck, the terror giving me a strength I never knew I possessed. I didn't stop running until I had slammed the door, locked it, and was speeding away, leaving a cloud of dust and my sanity behind in that silent, hateful grove. I don't remember the drive back to the ranger station. I only remember the blinding tunnel of my headlights on the dirt road and the frantic, animalistic gasps for air that were my own. My hands were locked on the steering wheel in a death grip, my knuckles white. My mind was a chaotic storm of images, the glowing embers of those eyes, the impossible shape of the creature detaching itself from the trees, the steady, patient thud of its footsteps behind me. It wasn't a chase. It was a dismissal. It had let me go. The thought was somehow more terrifying than if it had tried to kill me. It meant it wasn't afraid. It meant it knew it could find me again. When I stumbled into my small, park-issued cabin, I slammed the door and bolted it, leaning back against the wood as if I could physically hold the entire desert at bay. My body was shaking uncontrollably. I was covered in scratches, my uniform torn, my face streaked with dirt and tears. In my hand, I still clutched Julian Croft's camera. It felt both like a sacred relic and a cursed object, a physical piece of the nightmare I now held in my hands. For hours, I sat in the dark, the whiskey bottle my only companion. I didn't turn on the lights. The darkness inside felt safer than the vast, watching darkness outside. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Was that a footstep? Was that the low, clicking sound I'd heard in the grove? My sanctuary had become a trap, and I was the terrified animal cowering inside. My duty was to report my findings, to walk into Henderson's office, place the camera on his desk, and tell him everything. But what would I say? "Sir, the missing hiker was taken by the Yucca Man, a local legend I previously dismissed as folklore. Here's a blurry photo of its hairy leg and glowing eyes. Oh, and by the way, I broke about a dozen protocols by going out there alone at night off the official search grid. They wouldn't just fire me, they'd have me committed. My career, my reputation, my sanity, all would be shattered. And what would they do? Send a heavily armed team into the grove. They wouldn't find anything. The creature was not of our world. It played by different rules. It would simply melt back into the landscape, becoming just another twisted tree waiting. The search for Julian Croft was officially scaled back after 3 more days. The official narrative was set, a tragic but common case of a solo hiker getting lost and succumbing to the elements. His family wept. The news ran a short segment. And then the desert fell silent again. But for me, the silence was screaming. I was living on a knife's edge. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I jumped at every shadow. The other rangers started to give me a wide berth, whispering about my erratic behavior. They thought I was cracking under the pressure. They had no idea. The creature began to torment me. It was subtle at first. A single massive footprint, identical to the ones in the grove, found in the dust just outside my cabin door one morning. There was no other sign, No trail leading to or from it. It was just there. A message. I know where you live. I frantically erased it, my heart pounding against my ribs, looking over my shoulder at the silent, watching hills. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was the deep, guttural cry the campers had described, the sound of rocks grinding in a giant's throat. But it wasn't coming from miles away in a distant canyon. It was right outside my window. I crawled from my bed, my body rigid with fear, and peered through a crack in the blinds. I saw nothing but the moonlit desert, but I knew it was out there, watching me. It was reminding me that the flimsy wooden walls of my cabin were no protection at all. The final straw came a week after Julian's disappearance. I was on patrol, deliberately staying in the most populated, safe parts of the park when a call came over the radio. A new family, camping in a different area miles from Cottonwood, reported that their young daughter had seen a big, hairy man watching them from the rocks at dusk. They laughed it off as a child's imagination, but they wanted to report it just in case. A cold dread, absolute and final, settled over me. It was moving. It was expanding its territory. Or perhaps its territory had always been the entire park, and we were just now beginning to notice. The lie I had told, the truth I had buried, was putting others in danger. I drove back to the station, my mind made up. I couldn't stay. I couldn't fight it. To stay would be to wait for my own inevitable disappearance, to become another footnote in a missing person file. But I couldn't leave without doing one last thing. That night, I packed a single bag. I took Julian's camera and my service pistol. I wrote a short, simple resignation letter, citing personal health reasons, and left it on my desk. Then I drove not towards the highway, but back towards the Lost Palms Oasis trailhead. I parked Julian's car key on the driver's seat of his abandoned vehicle, a small, futile gesture of respect. Then I took the camera and walked to the trailhead information board. Inside the glass case, alongside maps and warnings about dehydration, was the missing person flyer for Julian Croft. His smiling, hopeful face stared out at me. With trembling hands, I took the memory card from his camera. I wrapped it in a small plastic bag and used a rock to wedge it deep into a crack in the wooden frame of the information board, hiding it from casual view but leaving it where it might, one day, be found. It was the best I could do. It was a coward's solution, but it was something. The evidence was there, waiting for someone who was willing to see it. As I walked back to my truck, I felt a change in the air. The oppressive, watchful silence descended again. I didn't need to turn around. I knew it was there, somewhere in the darkness, seeing me off. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I drove through the night, not stopping until the surreal shapes of the Joshua trees were replaced by the familiar glow of city lights on the horizon. My name is Eleanor Vance. That is a name I no longer use. I live in a city now, surrounded by the comforting, anonymous noise of millions. I work a quiet job. I never go camping. I never walk in the woods. Sometimes, late at night, I search online forums for stories about Joshua Tree, for whispers of the Yucca Man. I read the new reports of missing hikers, and a cold sickness fills my stomach. I know the truth. I know that the desert has its own brand of weird, its own ancient secrets. And I know that some of those secrets are hungry. I filed my report as unidentified animal, but I know what I saw. I saw a monster, and I ran. And I will be running for the rest of my life. My name is Frank Peterson, and for 37 years, the title of Supervisory Park Ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park was more than a job. It was the very marrow in my bones. It defined the rhythm of my life, from the crisp, pine-scented air of pre-dawn patrols to the wary satisfaction of closing a search and rescue operation as twilight painted the peaks in shades of purple and orange. The mountains were my office, my sanctuary, and, on more occasions than I care to admit, my adversary. Now, with retirement looming less than a week away, a strange and unsettling silence had begun to creep into the familiar cadence of my existence. The paperwork felt lighter, the radio chatter seemed distant, and the faces of the younger rangers I'd trained looked at me with a mixture of respect and a subtle, unspoken farewell. Most men my age look forward to retirement as a finish line. They dream of golf courses, fishing trips where the only concern is the bait, or simply the quiet luxury of a morning without an alarm clock. I suppose a part of me wanted that too. My wife, Clara, had already picked out a new set of gardening tools for me. But another, more insistent part of me felt a gnawing unease, a sense of a task left undone. It was a single, frayed thread in the otherwise tightly woven tapestry of my career, A discordant note in a lifetime of service. It had a name, Leo Martinez. The case file was 2 decades old. Its manila folder softened and frayed at the edges from years of being pulled from the archives, looked at with a sigh, and then reluctantly returned. Leo Martinez, age 21, a university student from Boulder, an aspiring photographer with a passion for capturing the raw, untamed beauty of the Rockies. He had signed the Trailhead Register on a clear August morning 20 years ago, noting his destination as the remote and seldom visited valley that flanked the base of Arrowhead Peak. He was equipped for a 2-day solo hike. He was never seen again. I was a younger ranger back then, full of piss and vinegar, certain that our training and knowledge of the terrain made us invincible. The search for Leo was one of the largest in the park's recent history. For 2 weeks, we combed every inch of that valley. We had helicopters in the air, dog teams on the ground, and a grid search pattern so meticulous it felt like we were counting the stones in every creek bed. On the 4th day, we found his backpack. It was propped carefully against a large granite boulder near a rushing creek, almost as if he had set it down to take a short break. Inside, we found his water filter, a half-eaten bag of trail mix, his sleeping bag, and his journal. The last entry was brief, almost poetic. "The silence here is different," he wrote. "It's not empty. It's watching." But of Leo Martinez there was no trace. No broken branches, no drag marks, no sign of a struggle with an animal. He had, for all intents and purposes, simply evaporated from the face of the earth. We searched until the first autumn snows forced us to call it off, and the case went from an active search to a cold case, a ghost that haunted the park's official records. It bothered me more than the others. I had been the one to speak with his parents, to see the hope in their eyes slowly curdle into a permanent, hollow grief. I had promised them we would find their son. It was a promise I had failed to keep, so on the Monday of my final week, I made a decision that Clara called foolish, and my second in command, a sharp young ranger named Sarah, called reckless. I was going back out to that valley, alone. Frank, with all due respect, what's the point? Sarah had argued, leaning against the doorframe of my office. It's been 20 years. The terrain has changed. Whatever was out there is long gone. It's a loose end, Sarah, I said, pulling my old trusted hiking pack from the closet. The scent of canvas and leather filled the small room. I'm the only one left who was on the original ground team. I need to see it one more time, to close the book myself. She saw the look in my eyes and knew there was no arguing. She just nodded, her expression a mask of professional concern. "Your radio better be on the whole time. Check in every 2 hours, at Frank. That valley, it has a reputation." She was right. Among the seasoned staff, the area was unofficially known as the Lost Basin. It wasn't just Leo. Over the years, other hikers had reported strange occurrences there, a sudden, disorienting fog on a clear day, the feeling of being followed, compasses spinning uselessly. Of course, these were just stories, the kind of campfire lore that springs up in wild places. But every story has a seed of truth. The hike out was a journey back in time. The first few miles were on a well-maintained trail, the kind frequented by tourists in bright-colored jackets, their laughter echoing through the aspens. But then I took the turn off, an unmarked path that was little more than a game trail. The forest immediately grew denser, the air cooler. The cheerful sounds of other hikers vanished, replaced by the whisper of the wind through ancient pines and the scuttling of unseen things in the undergrowth. This was the park as it was meant to be, wild, indifferent, and vast. I felt the familiar comfort of solitude settle over me. For hours, it was just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on pine needles and the steady beat of my own heart. I was a good hiker, my pace steady, my senses alert. Yet, as the sun climbed higher, a different feeling began to prickle at the back of my neck. It was the same feeling Leo had described in his journal. The silence wasn't empty, it was watchful. I'd spent a lifetime in the wilderness and was no stranger to its tricks. I knew how a shifting shadow could look like a lurking figure, how the wind could mimic a human voice. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the morbid nature of my quest. I stopped for a moment, taking a long drink from my canteen and scanning the dense woods around me. Nothing. Just the immense, silent majesty of the mountains. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It was a primal instinct, a throwback to a time when our ancestors were prey, not predator. The feeling of eyes on you. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, my hand straying to the handle of the large knife sheathed on my belt. By late afternoon, I reached the granite boulder by the creek. It was exactly as I remembered it from the crime scene photos, covered in a thick carpet of moss, but otherwise unchanged by 2 decades of wind and snow. This was where Leo's journey had ended, and where my obsession had begun. I dropped my pack and sat on the cold stone, the roar of the creek filling the air. As I surveyed the valley, a deep, oppressive basin of trees surrounded by jagged, unforgiving ridges, I scanned the high ground. That's when I saw it. A brief, sharp glint of light from the ridgeline to the north. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. It could have been a piece of quartz or a patch of wet rock catching the sun. Or it could have been the reflection from a pair of binoculars. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition. It was a cold, hard certainty. I was not alone in the Lost Basin. The knot of ice in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard fist. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My world had shrunk to the rushing sound of the creek and the silent, menacing ridgeline. My training, honed over nearly 4 decades of service, took over. I didn't stand up or call out. Instead, I slowly, deliberately slid off the granite boulder and used it as cover, my body low to the ground. The glint was gone, but the impression of it was burned into my mind. It wasn't the random flash of sunlight on wet rock. It was focused, intentional. It was the precise, circular reflection of a lens. My hand went to the small pair of binoculars hanging around my neck. With movements that were fluid and economical, I brought them to my eyes, resting my elbows on the mossy surface of the boulder to steady my hands. I scanned the ridge line, moving from left to right, inch by painstaking inch. I traced the jagged crest, dipping into the saddles and scrutinizing every cluster of rock and stunted, wind-battered pine. Nothing. Whoever was there was either gone or had concealed themselves with an expert's skill. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold through me. This wasn't a lost tourist. A casual hiker wouldn't be watching me from a remote ridge with binoculars. This was someone who knew this terrain, someone who belonged here in a way that I, even with all my years, did not. My mind raced, reevaluating everything. The stories about the Lost Basin, the unsettling entry in Leo Martinez's journal. The feeling of being watched was no longer a ghost of my imagination. It had a potential source, a physical presence on that ridge. Was this the same person who had watched Leo 20 years ago? The idea was absurd, the kind of thing you'd read in a pulp novel. But out here, with the weight of the wilderness pressing in, the line between the rational and the terrifyingly possible began to blur. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that crept across the valley floor like grasping fingers. The air grew colder, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the coming night. I had a choice to make pack up and hike out, putting as much distance as possible between myself and this valley before dark, or stay and finish what I started. The sensible part of my brain, the part that sounded a lot like my wife Clara, was screaming at me to leave. But the stubborn, duty-bound ranger, the man who had made a silent promise to Leo's parents, refused to budge. Leaving now would feel like a retreat, a surrender. It would mean this case would remain a ghost, not just in the files, but in my own mind for whatever years I had left. I wasn't leaving, but I wasn't going to be stupid either. I unclipped the radio from my belt. The scheduled check-in with Sarah was in 10 minutes. I thought about what to tell her. Sarah, I think there's someone up here watching me. She'd have a team scrambled and a helicopter in the air before I could finish the sentence. I'd be the old fool who cried wolf on his last week, pulled out of the field for his own safety. No, I would handle this myself. I was still a ranger. This was still my park. I moved away from the exposed position by the creek, melting back into the tree line. I found a small, defensible clearing, a shallow depression with a thick, trunked pine at my back and a clear view of the valley in front of me. This would be my camp for the night. I worked quickly, my movements efficient and quiet. I didn't build a fire. A fire would be a beacon, a confirmation to the watcher on the ridge that I was still here and exactly where I'll camp it would be. At precisely 1800 hours, the radio crackled. Dispatch to Ranger Peterson. Status check. I pressed the button. Peterson here. I said, my voice deliberately calm and even. All's quiet. I'm at the location of the Martinez pack, making camp for the night. Over. There was a slight pause. Copy that, Frank. You sound tired. Everything okay? Sarah's voice. She knew me too well. Just old Sarah. Not used to these long hauls anymore. I lied. I'll check in at 0800. Peterson out. I clipped the radio back to my belt. The silence that followed feeling heavier than before. The lie sat uneasily in my gut. I had just isolated myself completely. Whatever happened tonight, I was on my own. As dusk bled into true darkness, the forest transformed. The familiar shapes of trees became monstrous silhouettes against a sky awash with a sea of stars. The sounds changed too. The wind whispered secrets through the branches, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I ate my rations cold, my back pressed against the solid trunk of the pine, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the small circle of my headlamp's beam. My senses were on fire, straining to catch any sound that was out of place. I wasn't just waiting for morning. My purpose for being here had shifted. I was no longer just looking for a 20-year-old clue. I was looking for evidence of a current presence. After I finished my meal, I switched off my headlamp, allowing my eyes to adjust to the gloom. The moon was a sliver, providing little light. I began to move in a slow, expanding circle from my campsite, using the terrain for cover, my feet making barely a sound on the damp earth. I was hunting now. I focused on the area upstream from the boulder where Leo's pack was found. The original search had concentrated downstream, following the logic that if he had fallen into the creek, his body would have been washed that way. But what if he had gone the other way? I pushed through a thicket of willows, their branches whipping at my face, and found myself in a small, secluded meadow. The ground here was softer, marshier, and something was wrong. In the center of the meadow, a patch of earth seemed disturbed. It was subtle, something a less experienced eye would have missed. The vegetation was younger, the soil slightly sunken in a roughly rectangular shape. My heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against my ribs. I knelt, my old knees protesting, and touched the ground. It was firm, but it felt different. Looser. I took out my knife and began to dig, first with the tip of the blade, then with my bare hands, scooping away the dark, rich soil. It didn't take long. My fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. Not a rock. I scraped away more dirt, my breath catching in my throat. It was bone, a human rib cage. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy, ignoring the cold mud seeping into my clothes. I uncovered more, a spine, a pelvis. And then I found the skull. It was mostly intact, resting at an unnatural angle. I pulled a powerful flashlight from my pack and aimed its beam into the shallow grave. The beam illuminated the stark white of the bone against the black earth. And then I saw it. Just above the right temple, a small, perfectly round hole, a bullet hole. This changed everything. Leo Martinez hadn't gotten lost. He hadn't been taken by an animal. He was murdered. Executed right here in this remote, forgotten valley. A wave of nausea and cold fury washed over me. For 20 years, his parents had lived with the torment of not knowing. The truth was here all along, buried under a few feet of dirt. I scrambled out of the grave, my mind reeling. I had to call it in. This was a crime scene. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. I raised it to my mouth, my thumb pressing down on the transmit button. The world seemed to fade away, the only reality being the static hiss of the radio and the horrific discovery at my feet. Dispatch. I croaked, my voice a raw whisper. This is Ranger Peterson. I found him. I found Leo Martinez. It's a 1080. I repeat, a 1080. A snap. The sound was sharp, loud, and impossibly close. It came from the tree line directly behind me. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy foot stepping on a dry twig. My blood ran cold. I froze, the radio still clutched in my hand. Slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, I turned around. There, at the edge of the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's glow, a figure stood. A man. He was gaunt, his frame weary and weathered like an old tree. He was just standing there watching me. Then a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, revealing broken, stained teeth. It took you long enough to find him. He said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that cut through the night. I was getting lonely. My time seemed to fracture. The world compressed into the space between me and the figure at the edge of the trees. The cold night air, the roar of the creek, the solid weight of the radio in my hand, it all faded into a distant hum. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, suddenly felt deathly still. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I was paralyzed, pinned in place by that horrifying, broken-toothed smile and the chillingly casual words that hung in the air. I was getting lonely. My training was a deep-seated reflex, but it had no protocol for this. It had procedures for bear attacks, for avalanches, for confronting armed poachers. It had nothing for a ghost who steps out of the darkness and confesses to a 20-year-old murder as if commenting on the weather. The man took a slow step forward, and the spell was broken. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. My thumb was still on the radio's transmit button. "Dispatch, I have a suspect, armed and hostile," I said, my voice low and tight, hoping the transmission was getting through. "Repeat, suspect in the Martinez case. He is here." The man's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of curiosity, like a dog tilting its head at a strange new sound. "Talking to your friends," he rasped, taking another step. He was holding something in his right hand. It was long and dark, an old hunting rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with age and use. "They can't help you. No one comes here. Not anymore. Not after your boy." My mind was a whirlwind of tactical assessment and pure, unadulterated terror. He was 20 yards away, too far to rush. My sidearm was holstered, but bringing it out would be a death sentence if he was even halfway competent with that rifle. My only advantages were my flashlight, currently painting a stark white circle on his chest, and the element of surprise which had just evaporated, and the grave. The shallow, open grave of Leo Martinez was between us. Why? The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. It was the question that had haunted me for 2 decades. The man stopped, his gaunt face a mask of strange contemplation in the harsh glare of my light. "He was like you," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, full of noise. "He came into my valley with his little clicking box, taking pictures. Said he was going to show the world. Show them my home." He gestured vaguely at the oppressive darkness of the surrounding forest. "This place is quiet. It likes to be quiet." He was going to bring the others. The loud ones. I couldn't let him. The simple, insane logic of it was more terrifying than any complex motive. This man wasn't just a murderer. He was a self-appointed guardian of this forgotten piece of wilderness, and his idea of conservation was absolute. "So you killed him," I stated, my voice steadier than I thought. I needed to keep him talking. I needed time. I warned him. The man said, a defensive edge to his tone. Told him to turn back. He just smiled at me, said the park was for everyone. He didn't understand, so I made him stay, made him part of the quiet. He looked past me, towards the open grave, with an expression of something disturbingly close to affection. He's been good company. Doesn't talk much. A wave of revulsion and fury gave me strength. His name was Leo Martinez. He had a family. He has me. The man snapped, his brief moment of calm shattering. He raised the rifle slightly. "And now I have you. You're a ranger. You understand the quiet, don't you? You can stay, too. We'll be good company, the 3 of us." He was going to kill me. The realization was as cold and hard as the bone I'd unearthed. He'd kill me, bury me here, and wait for the next poor soul to stumble into his sanctuary. My final week of service would end with me becoming another ghost in the Lost Basin. No. I promised Claire I'd be home. I promised Leo's parents I'd find their son. I was going to keep one of those promises. I angled my flashlight beam directly into his eyes. He flinched, snarling and raising a hand to shield his face. In that split second, I acted. I didn't run away. I ran forward directly towards him, shouting into the radio as I moved. "He's at the grave site! North ridge of Arrowhead! Send everyone!" The man, blinded and disoriented, fired the rifle. The shot was deafening in the enclosed valley, a massive roar that echoed off the ridges. I felt a searing heat pass by my ear, and the bullet tore through the radio, clipped to my belt, ripping it from its mooring and sending a shower of sparks and shattered plastic into the night. My only link to the outside world was gone. I didn't stop. I closed the distance, my 60-year-old body screaming in protest, and slammed into him with all the force I could muster. We tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the rifle skittering away into the darkness. He was shockingly strong, his wary frame all muscle and bone. His hands, rough as bark, clawed at my face. His breath was a foul stench of rot and decay. We rolled on the damp earth, a desperate, grunting struggle between 2 old men in the middle of nowhere. He was driven by madness, I by a sheer, primal will to live. He got a hand around my throat, his thumb pressing into my windpipe. Black spots danced in my vision. My fingers scrabbled in the dirt, searching for a rock, a branch, anything. My hand closed around the handle of my knife. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I brought the knife up, not the blade, but the heavy pommel, and smashed it into his temple. He grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. I twisted away, gasping for air, and scrambled backwards on my hands and knees. He was already getting up, shaking his head like a wounded animal, his eyes burning with a furious, murderous light. He saw his rifle lying near the edge of the grave. We both moved for it. But I wasn't going for the rifle. I was going for the grave. As he lunged for his weapon, I lowered my shoulder and drove myself into his legs, tackling him from the side. His balance, already precarious on the soft, excavated earth, was gone. He stumbled, arms flailing, and with a cry of surprise and pain, he fell backwards into the shallow, rectangular hole, landing with a sickening crunch of bone on bone. He let out a scream, a high, piercing sound of pure agony that was quickly cut off. His leg was bent at an impossible angle beneath him. He had landed directly on the skeletal remains of Leo Martinez. I stood over him, chest heaving, every muscle aching. He was trapped, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. He looked from his shattered leg to me, his madness momentarily replaced by a look of pathetic confusion. The silence that followed was profound. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the man's pained whimpers. I picked up his ancient rifle. It was a single shot. He wouldn't have had a second chance anyway. I looked down at the man, a broken creature in a makeshift tomb of his own making, lying atop the bones of his last victim. My rage was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow weariness. I was too exhausted to even feel relief. I just stood there under the cold, indifferent stars until I heard it, faintly in the far distance, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades, growing steadily louder. Sarah had heard me. My broken message, my last desperate shout, had been enough. When they found me, I was sitting on the granite boulder where it had all started, the old rifle across my lap. I didn't say a word. I just pointed towards the meadow. Retirement is quiet. Clara fusses over the garden, and the days bleed one into the next with a peaceful monotony I once craved. The Park Service officially closed the case of Leo Martinez. They gave me a medal. His parents sent me a letter, tear-stained and filled with a gratitude that felt heavier than any stone. They said I had brought their son home, that I had given them peace. But I have no peace. Every night, when the house is still and the darkness presses against the windows, I leave my quiet suburban street and go back to that valley. I see the glint of binoculars on a lonely ridge. I feel the weight of a watchful silence. And I hear a dry, rasping voice whisper out of the gloom, a chilling invitation to stay and be company for the quiet. I close the book on Leo Martinez, but the story of the Lost Basin, my story, will never truly be over. My name is Grace. To be more formal, it's Grace Alistair, though I haven't felt like an Alistair for the better part of a year. That name belongs to a life I left behind in the city, a life of shared calendars, PTA meetings, and the low, constant hum of 1,000 obligations. It belongs to Mark. And for the summer at least, it belongs to my daughter, Lily. The decision to take a job as a fire lookout was not a rash one, though Mark certainly saw it that way. He called it an escape, a dereliction. Perhaps he was right. But after the separation, the silence in our suburban home had become a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered every room. It was a silence filled with ghosts of laughter and arguments we'd never have again. I needed a different kind of silence, a clean one. One that was vast and empty, where I could hear myself think, or better yet, not think at all. The job posting for the Osprey Peak lookout in the heart of the Cascade National Forest seemed like a direct answer to a prayer I hadn't realized I'd been making. Seeking vigilant, self-sufficient individual for seasonal fire watch. Must be comfortable with extreme isolation. Extreme isolation sounded less like a warning and more like a promise. The journey to the tower was a gradual shedding of the world. First, the highway gave way to a 2-lane county road, then to a winding strip of asphalt that clung to the mountainside. Finally, I turned onto a gravel service road where the dust kicked up by my tires was the only sign of movement for miles. The last leg of the journey was on foot. I met a senior ranger named Dave at the trailhead. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind, with kind eyes that held a hint of wary professionalism. Everything you need for the next 3 months is either up there or in these packs, he said, adjusting a heavy-looking rucksack on my shoulders. Radio check in every morning at Doe 800, every evening at 2000. Report any smoke any time. Simple as that. He handed me a set of heavy, old-fashioned keys. She's all yours, Grace. The view's worth the climb. You wasn't wrong. The tower was a skeletal metal structure, 100 feet of stairs spiraling up into the sky, culminating in a single 14 by 14 foot room enclosed in glass. When I finally pushed open the trapdoor and stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. The world fell away in every direction. A rolling sea of green and blue, of ancient firs and jagged, snow-dusted peaks, stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind against the glass. It was perfect. The living space was Spartan: a small cot, a metal desk bolted to the floor, a wood-burning stove, and the all-important Osborne Firefinder, a complex brass instrument for pinpointing the location of smoke. It was clean, functional, and blessedly empty of personal touches. Except for one. Taped to the center of the desk was a single sheet of yellowing paper, folded neatly in half. The handwriting was a jagged, forceful script. At the top it read a few things to keep in mind. I smiled, assuming it was a list of quirks left by my predecessor, tips on a sticky window or a finicky stove. I unfolded it one. Keep the logbook updated. Every entry, every time. Management gets fussy too. Report smoke immediately. Don't second guess. 3. Secure the trapdoor firmly before dusk. 4. Don't leave food out. Not for the bears. 5. If you see a light on the distant ridge that isn't on your map, don't report it. It doesn't want to be seen. 6. Avoid looking at your reflection in the glass after midnight. What you see might not always be you. 7. If you hear whistling nearby, the source is far away. If you hear it far away, it is very near. 8. The wind can play tricks. It can sound like tapping on the glass. Ignore it. 9. Some nights you might smell something like rain on hot asphalt, even in a drought. Stay inside. 10. The old generator is loud, but the silence that follows when it runs out of fuel is louder. Keep it filled. 11. Your family is not here. Do not listen to their voices. I read the list twice. My initial amusement curdled into a vague sense of unease. Rules 1 through 4 were standard procedure, but the rest, they were bizarre. Not for the bears. It doesn't want to be seen. It felt like the beginning of a campfire story. I laughed it off, a nervous, breathy sound that seemed too small in the vast emptiness. A prank. It had to be a prank, a little bit of hazing for the new recruit. I folded the paper and tucked it into the back of the logbook, determined to forget it. The first week was idyllic. I fell into a simple, soul-soothing rhythm. I woke with the sun, the sky a soft palette of pink and gold. I'd make coffee, my movements slow and deliberate, then sit at the desk and scan the endless forest with my binoculars. I'd make my radio calls to Dave, his crackling voice a comforting, twice daily tether to the human world. I read books I'd meant to read for years. I watched eagles ride the thermals. The silence I had craved washed over me, cleansing the noise from my soul. I felt my frayed edges beginning to smooth over. I wrote long letters to Lily, describing the chipmunks and the shapes I saw in the clouds, letters I would mail when I went for supplies in a month. The first crack in my perfect solitude appeared on the 9th night. The sky was clear and star-dusted, the moon a brilliant silver disk. As I was making my final entry in the logbook, I heard it. A faint, melodic whistling like a half-remembered folk song. It was so distant it was barely there, a ghost of a sound on the edge of hearing. I stood up and went to the western window, peering out into the profound darkness. The sound seemed to be coming from far, far away down in the valley somewhere. Then, Rule 87 surfaced in my memory unbidden. If you hear it far away, it is very near. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I dismissed it instantly. It was the wind, an animal, my own mind playing tricks. But I grabbed the high-powered binoculars anyway, my hands suddenly slick with sweat. I scanned the immediate area around the tower, the clearing at its base, the first line of trees. Nothing, just the silent, monolithic shapes of the forest under the moonlight. The whistling continued for another minute, a lonely, wandering tune, before fading into the vast silence as if it had never been. I checked the lock on the trapdoor 3 times before I could force myself to get into my cot. 2 nights later, the weather turned. The sky, which had been my placid blue companion, became a bruised, turbulent ceiling of gray. The wind, once a whisper, became a howl, battering the small cabin with a physical force that made the whole tower sway almost imperceptibly. Rain came in horizontal sheets, blurring the world into a watercolor wash. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was in the heart of the storm, a tiny, defiant speck of warmth and light against the raw power of nature. I made my evening radio call, but Dave's voice was lost in a sea of static. I could only make out a few words. Severe, be careful, talk in the morning. The radio hissed and died. I was truly alone now, cut off. I lit the oil lamp, its golden glow pushing back against the frantic, strobing flashes of lightning outside. The storm was a symphony of chaos, the roar of the wind, the percussive drumming of rain on the roof, the deep resonant boom of thunder that vibrated through the floor and up my spine. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. I found myself listening, my senses on high alert. I was listening for the tapping that was just the wind. I was listening for the whistling. But what came was something else entirely. It was during a momentary lull between thunderclaps, a pocket of near silence, a voice. A child's voice, small and frightened, carried on the wind from the base of the tower. Mummy. My blood turned to ice. Every muscle in my body locked. It was impossible. It was 100 miles of winding road and dense forest away. But the voice was unmistakable. It was the sweet, high-pitched timbre of my 7-year-old daughter.
Mommy.
I'm scared. Let me in. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I scrambled to the trapdoor, my hand hovering over the heavy iron bolt. Maternal instinct screamed at me, a primal, overwhelming command: your child is in trouble. Go to her. But then, like a shard of ice in my gut, the last rule on that yellowed piece of paper flashed in my mind, as clear and bright as the lightning outside. Eleven, your family is not here. Do not listen to their voices.
Please, Mommy.
It's so dark! The voice was closer now, laced with a sob that tore at the very fiber of my being. It sounded like it was coming from just below the trapdoor. I could almost feel her small hands reaching up for me in the storm. It was Lily. It was my Lily. But she was with Mark. She was safe. She had to be. I backed away from the trapdoor, my body trembling uncontrollably. I pressed myself into the far corner of the room, my eyes wide with terror, fixed on the bolted square of wood in the floor, as the voice of the daughter I loved more than life itself continued to beg and cry for me in the heart of the raging storm. The hours between the last desperate plea from Lily's voice and the first gray light of dawn were the longest of my life. I remained huddled in the corner, a prisoner in my own sanctuary, listening to the storm rage and my own heart pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The voice did not return. The silence it left behind was somehow more terrifying than its cries. It was a void filled with questions and a suffocating, primal fear. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, was a new threat. My mind, starved for rational explanation, became a battlefield. It was a trick of the wind. It was an auditory hallucination, a product of stress and isolation. But the conviction, cold and heavy in my gut, refused to yield. What I had heard was real. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The sky was a tender, bruised purple, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Sleep had been impossible. I felt brittle, my nerves stretched to their breaking point. My first, most urgent need was to get to the radio. I practically fell upon the device, my hands shaking as I flicked the switch. Osprey peaked to base. Dave, do you copy? Over. Static. A thick, impenetrable wall of it. Dave, this is Grace at Osprey Peak. Please respond. It's an emergency. Over. I tried again and again, adjusting the frequency, my voice growing more frantic with each failed attempt. The radio remained stubbornly silent, save for the useless, mocking hiss. The storm must have damaged the repeater on the mountain. I was cut off. The tether to the world, to sanity, was severed. The need to know if Lily was safe became a physical ache, a burning pressure behind my eyes. I had to believe she was fine, tucked in her bed miles away. I had to believe the rule: your family is not here. But the memory of her voice, so full of terror, was a poison seeping into my thoughts. The day passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sit still. I paced the small room like a caged animal, my eyes constantly scanning the vast, indifferent wilderness below. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden shape. Every rustle of leaves in the breeze sounded like a footstep. The perfect silence I had craved was now my tormentor, amplifying every tiny sound and feeding my paranoia. I found myself staring at the list of rules, which I had retrieved from the back of the logbook. It no longer felt like a prank. It felt like a lifeline, a set of cryptic instructions for survival in a place that operated under a different set of natural laws. My eyes kept drifting to Rule Hey 6A, avoid looking at your reflection in the glass after midnight. What you see might not always be you. That night, I fought to keep my gaze averted from the windows, which had transformed into black, reflective mirrors. I kept the oil lamp burning, its gentle light a fragile shield against the oppressive darkness outside. But my curiosity, morbid and insistent, began to gnaw at me. What had the previous ranger seen? What was so terrible about a reflection? Just after midnight, I couldn't resist any longer. It was a small act of defiance, a way to prove to myself that I was still in control. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked slowly to the nearest window. My reflection stared back at me, a pale, haunted-looking woman framed against the darkness. Her face was my face, her eyes were my eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion. I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hand was clenched into a fist at her side. It was just me, A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me feel dizzy. I had let my imagination run wild. It was all in my head. I let out a small, shaky laugh, and then my blood ran cold. In the reflection, the woman's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile. It was a wide, predatory grin that did not touch her eyes, which remained locked on mine, filled with a cold, ancient malice. My own face remained frozen in a mask of terror. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't moving at all. I stumbled back with a strangled cry, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I scrambled away, crabbed, walking backward until I hit the opposite wall, my eyes still fixed on the window. The reflection was gone. There was only the blackness of the night. The next 2 days were a descent into a waking nightmare. I stopped trying the radio. I stopped keeping the log. My world had shrunk to the 14 by 14-foot room and the hostile wilderness that surrounded it. I subsisted on water and dry crackers, my stomach in a permanent knot of fear. I dozed in fits and starts during the day, too terrified to allow myself the vulnerability of sleep at night. I began to understand Rule Fan Tunny, the old generator is loud, but the silence that follows when it runs out of fuel is louder. The silence was a living thing, and it was listening. On the third day after the storm, driven by a desperate need for answers, I turned to the logbook. I wasn't interested in my own scant entries, but in those of the person who came before me, the author of the rules. His name was Jacob. His entries started much like mine, observations about the weather, wildlife sightings, the simple peace of the place. But as the summer progressed, his neat, methodical handwriting began to change. It grew spidery, erratic. July 12th. Whistling again tonight. Sounds like it's right outside the door. I know it's not. Stayed away from the windows. July 23rd, the smell is back. Like a summer shower on a hot road. But there hasn't been rain for weeks. Makes my teeth ache. So Rule Fay 9V, August 4th saw the light on Ghost Ridge again. It's not a campfire. It moves too fast. Watched it for an hour. It feels like it's watching me back. The Rule Pain 5, the final entry was dated September 2nd, the day before Dave told me Jacob had left. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the pen having dug so deep it nearly tore the page. It knows my name, was tapping on the glass, whispering my name. I saw its face in the reflection. It's wearing my face now. I have to get out. I have to warn them. Don't listen to the voices, it's not them. It's never them. A profound, bone-deep chill settled over me. This wasn't a hallucination. Jacob had seen it too. He had experienced it all, and he had fled. But what was it? That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, I was scanning the forest, my binoculars a permanent extension of my eyes. I wasn't looking for smoke. I was looking for anything out of place. And I found it. Down in a small clearing, about half a mile from the base of the tower, something was moving. It was a person. At first, I felt a surge of hope. A hiker, a lost camper, someone I could call to for help. I adjusted the focus, my heart starting to beat faster. The figure was tall and thin, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. It was wearing clothes that looked vaguely like a ranger's uniform, but they were tattered and mud-stained. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and slowly, deliberately, turned its head to look directly up at my tower. Even from that distance, I could feel the intensity of its gaze. It raised a hand not in a wave, but with a single, pointing finger aimed right at me. And then, its head tilted back, and a sound drifted up through the still evening air, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end and my soul shrink within me. It was a faint, melodic whistling, the same half, remembered folk song I had heard on my 9th night. But this time, I could see the source. And according to the rule, if I could hear it from far away, it was already very, very near. The binoculars fell from my hands, clattering onto the wooden floor. The sound was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence that followed the whistling. My mind struggled to process the contradiction. The figure was half a mile away, yet the rule screamed that it was near. If you hear it far away, it is very near. It wasn't a riddle about acoustics. It was a statement about the nature of this place, about the thing that now stood in the clearing, pointing at me as if to say, I see you. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my paralysis. I threw the bolt on the trapdoor. It was already locked. But I had to check, and then I did the only thing I could think of. I extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the room into the deep twilight of the dying sun. My reasoning was primitive, that of a child hiding under the covers. If I couldn't see it, maybe it couldn't see me. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cool, dusty wood, my breath held tight in my chest. My sanctuary, my glass box in the sky, had become a trap. Every window was an eye, a potential entry point for a gaze I could not bear. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The world outside faded from orange to a deep, starless black. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now. It was heavy, expectant. It was the silence of a hunter waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Then came the tapping. It wasn't the gentle, random patter the wind might make. It was a deliberate, rhythmic tap. Tap, tap on the glass of the north, facing window. My heart leaped into my throat. I remembered Jacob's frantic scrawl. It was tapping on the glass, whispering my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for it to be the wind, for me to be insane. Tap, tap, tap. It moved to the next window, the eastern one, continuing its methodical circuit around my cage. It was testing the perimeter. It was reminding me that I was surrounded, 100 feet in the air with nowhere to go. And then the voice came again. This time it wasn't Lily. It was Mark. Grace, what in God's name are you doing? Open the door. His voice was laced with the familiar exasperation I knew so well. It was so perfectly him that for a split second, a sliver of insane hope pierced my terror. Maybe Dave had fixed the radio. Maybe Mark had driven all this way, worried sick. I know you're in there, Grace. Dave called me. Said your radio was out. I drove all night. Now stop this nonsense and let me up. The voice was coming from the base of the tower, just like Lily's had. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. Mark wouldn't be here. He thought this job was a foolish escape. He wouldn't drive for hours into a forest he despised. And he certainly wouldn't be standing at the bottom of a 100-foot tower in the dead of night. F11. Your family is not here. Do not listen to their voices. Don't you ignore me. Grace! The voice snarled, the frustration turning to anger. After everything, you pull a stunt like this.
You're being selfish! Think about Lily!
What is she supposed to think? The words were crafted to hurt, to find the cracks in my resolve. It was using my own guilt against me. I pulled a thin blanket over my head, a pathetic defense against the psychological assault. Underneath the blanket, another sound began to manifest, a smell. It was faint at first, then stronger, the scent of rain on hot asphalt. The smell from Rule 89. It was the smell of a city street in summer, a smell that had no place in this pristine wilderness. It was wrong. It was an intrusion, an olfactory violation that made my stomach churn. The tapping stopped. The voice of Mark fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the smell and my own ragged breathing. I thought, prayed, that it was over. Then the trapdoor rattled. It was a single, violent shake, as if something immense had thrown its weight against it from below. The heavy iron bolt held, but the entire floor vibrated from the impact. I let out a small, involuntary whimper. It was no longer just playing games. It was trying to get in. It rattled the door again, harder this time.
B.O.
The sound echoed in the small space. I scrambled away from the center of the room, pressing myself back into the corner where I had hidden from the storm. My eyes were locked on the trapdoor. I could almost see the wood splintering, the bolt giving way. And then, from directly beneath the floor, I heard the whistling. It wasn't far away anymore. It was right there. It was in the tower with me, separated only by a few inches of wood and steel. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. To stay was to wait for the bolt to break, for the thing wearing my face in the reflection to claim the real thing. Jacob had fled. It was the only option. My mind raced, fueled by adrenaline and terror. The trail was 5 miles of darkness, but it was my only path. The creature was at the base of the tower, trying to get up. My only chance was to go down. It was a mad plan, born of desperation, but it was a plan. I waited, my body coiled like a spring. I listened to the whistling, trying to pinpoint its location. It seemed to be moving around the base, circling. I needed a distraction. My eyes fell on the old generator by the west window. Rule Fate 10, the old generator is loud. With a surge of desperate energy, I crawled toward it. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the pull cord. It was a gamble. The noise would confirm my location, but it might also draw the creature's attention to that side of the tower, giving me a precious few seconds to get out the trapdoor and start my descent on the opposite side. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life with a deafening clatter, its floodlight bursting on and cutting a brilliant, stark white path into the forest. The whistling stopped instantly. Now? It was now or never. I lunged for the trapdoor, my fingers fumbling with the bolt. It slid back with a loud scrape. I threw the door open, not daring to look down, and swung my body onto the top step of the spiral staircase. The cold night air was a shock. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, plunging myself into near total darkness. The generators light a beacon on the far side of the tower. I started down the stairs, taking them two at a time, my hand gripping the icy metal railing. My only thought was down. Don't look, don't listen, just move. The generator's roar covered the sound of my footsteps. The metal stairs were slick with evening dew. 10 steps, 20. Halfway down, a new sound cut through the noise of the generator. A high-pitched shriek of pure rage. It came from the west side of the tower, from the light. It knew it had been tricked. I moved faster, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I risked a glance down. I could see the dark shape of the ground 50 feet below. I could also see another shape, a tall, thin silhouette, detaching itself from the shadows at the base of the tower and starting to climb. A scream lodged in my throat. It was coming up. It was impossibly fast, moving on all fours like an insect, its limbs scuttling up the metal framework. I didn't have time. I was never going to make it. In a final desperate act, I let go of the railing. I pushed off from the stairs and jumped. It was only 40 feet, maybe less. I landed in a thick, forgiving patch of pine needles and soft earth, the impact jarring my entire body, sending a bolt of pain up my leg. I didn't care. I was on the ground. I was free of the tower. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the fire in my ankle, and ran. I ran without looking back, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. The roar of the generator faded behind me, replaced by the sound of my own blood pounding in my ears and a horrifying, inhuman screeching that echoed through the forest. It was the sound of a predator whose prey had just escaped. I don't know how long I ran. I just followed the trail, a faint ribbon of dirt in the darkness, fueled by a terror so profound it was its own kind of energy. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line and saw the blessed, beautiful sight of my car, its shape a solid piece of civilization in the moonlight. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and jammed the key in the ignition. The engine turned over. I slammed the car into drive and stomped on the gas, spraying gravel as I fishtailed onto the service road. I drove with the interior light on, needing to see that I was alone. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not once. I knew with a certainty that will haunt me for the rest of my days, that if I looked, I would see a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the woods, its head tilted, watching me go. And I might see it raise a hand not in a wave, but with a single pointing finger. I never went back. I never found out what happened to my things in the tower. I quit the next day citing a family emergency. I hugged Lily so tight she complained I was squishing her. I tried to tell Mark, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. The chasm between us just grew wider. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I think I can hear a faint, melodic whistling on the wind. And I have to remind myself of the rule, flipping it for my new life, a desperate mantra against the memory of that dark summer night. If you hear it nearby, the source is far away. It's far away, it has to be. My name is Henry Coleman. For the past 3 years, my life has been beautifully intertwined with Clara's. She is, to put it simply, my anchor in a world that often feels adrift. Clara possesses a spirit that thrives in the wild, an almost primal connection to the rustling leaves and ancient whispers of the forest. I, on the other hand, am a product of the city. My world is one of concrete, the constant hum of traffic, and the artificial glow of streetlights. Nature for me was something to be admired from a distance, a picturesque scene in a documentary, not something to be immersed in. But for Clara, the wilderness was home. It was where she recharged, where the complexities of modern life melted away, leaving only the essential truths of existence. So, for our 3rd anniversary, I wanted to give her something that spoke to her soul. Not another fancy dinner or a piece of jewelry, but an experience. I suggested a weekend camping trip to Whispering Pines National Forest, a place she had talked about for years, her eyes lighting up with tales of its towering redwoods and pristine, star-filled skies. The look on her face when I proposed the idea was worth every ounce of my trepidation. It was a confirmation that, for once, I had truly understood. The drive to Whispering Pines was a gradual shedding of civilization. The 6-lane highways bled into 2-lane country roads, which in turn narrowed into a single, winding strip of asphalt that clung to the mountainside. Cell service vanished 2 hours in, replaced by the crackle of a local radio station that eventually dissolved into static. We were truly leaving the world behind. Our final stop before heading to our designated campsite was the Ranger Station, a rustic log cabin that seemed to have grown out of the forest floor. A plume of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney. Inside, a man who looked as old and weathered as the surrounding trees sat behind a large wooden desk. A nameplate read, Ranger Miller. He greeted us with a warm, crinkled smile, his eyes twinkling with a kindness that immediately put me at ease. Henry and Clara, right? Site 7 down by the creek. It's a beautiful spot, secluded. Clara, in her element, chatted easily with him, discussing trail conditions and recent wildlife sightings. I mostly just nodded along, trying to absorb the information on the large, topographical map pinned to the wall behind him. As we were about to leave, Ranger Miller's friendly demeanor shifted, just for a moment. A shadow of seriousness crossed his face. "No, you two be safe out there," he said, his voice a little lower than before. "We've got the usuals, beers, mountain lions. Keep your food locked up tight in the bear box. But it's the two-legged critters you sometimes have to worry more about." He paused, looking from me to Clara. "This forest is vast. People get turned around, lost sometimes. They just go missing. Stick to the marked trails and be aware of your surroundings. The woods, they can play tricks on you at night." I offered a confident smile I didn't feel. "We'll be careful, sir. Thank you." His warning lingered in the air as we drove the final 5 miles down a gravel road, each crunch of the tires under our car amplifying our isolation. We were the only ones here. The other campsites marked on the map were miles away. When we finally pulled into Creek Bend Site 7, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The site was, as the ranger had promised, beautiful. A small clearing was nestled among colossal pine trees that seemed to scratch at the sky. A gentle creek gurgled nearby, its song the only sound in the profound silence. It was idyllic, a perfect slice of untouched wilderness. But as the shadows grew longer, the beauty took on an edge of intimidation. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. We worked together, a practiced team. Clara directed the tent setup with an expert hand, while I gathered firewood, my city soft hands already feeling the strain. We built a roaring fire in the stone-lined pit, its cheerful crackle a welcome defiance against the encroaching darkness. As night fell completely, it brought a blackness I had never experienced. It was an inky, absolute dark, a physical presence that seemed to press in from all sides, held at bay only by the flickering circle of our firelight. Dinner was simple, sausages roasted on sticks and a can of beans heated over the flames. We talked and laughed, our voices feeling small in the vast emptiness. Clara pointed out the constellations as they emerged, pinpricks of diamond dust scattered across a velvet canvas. In that moment, sitting by the fire with her, my anxieties melted away. This was perfect. This was the gift I had wanted to give her. Exhausted from the travel and the fresh, clean air, we decided to turn in early. We made sure the fire was reduced to smoldering embers, and that every last scrap of food was sealed away in the heavy steel bear box, bolted to a concrete slab near our site. The forest had returned to its deep, humming silence, punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Inside the tent, zipped into our sleeping bags, the sense of security was absolute. The thin nylon walls felt like a fortress. I fell asleep with Clara's hand in mine, lulled by the gentle murmur of the creek and the peaceful rhythm of her breathing. I don't know what time it was. It must have been the deepest part of the night, that pitch black void between 2 and 4 a.m., when the world feels dead. I was ripped from a dreamless sleep by a sound. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't a twig snapping or an animal call. It was a loud, grating, mechanical shriek. A visceral jolt of adrenaline shot through me, cold and sharp. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. The sound had been a horrifying combination of metal dragging on stone and something being torn apart, all amplified as if through a distorted, blown-out loudspeaker. It was impossibly, unnaturally loud, and it had come from just down the road, terrifyingly close to our fragile sanctuary. Clara was awake, her body rigid beside me. I could feel the terror radiating from her. What was that? She whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. My own throat was tight with fear. The ranger's words echoed in my mind. The woods can play tricks on you. But this was no trick. This was real. It was a sound of deliberate, violent industry in a place where there should only be nature. I don't know. I whispered back, trying to force a calmness into my voice that I was nowhere near feeling. I wanted to protect her, to be the brave one. It's probably just an old generator from a cabin miles away. Sound travels funny out here at night. I knew I was lying. She knew I was lying. The sound hadn't been miles away. It had been right there, in our space, a monstrous intrusion into our perfect, isolated world. We lay there, frozen, every nerve ending on fire, listening. The crickets had fallen silent. The all was gone. The entire forest was holding its breath, and so were we. An hour passed, or maybe it was only 10 minutes. In the suffocating darkness of the tent, time had lost all meaning. It stretched and compressed, each second a drawn-out eternity of listening. The silence that had descended upon the forest was a heavy blanket, more terrifying than the shriek that had shattered it. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that follows a predator's roar, when all the smaller creatures have gone still, hiding and waiting. My lie about the sound being miles away hung in the air between us, a pathetic attempt at comfort that neither of us believed. Clara hadn't moved a muscle. Her breathing was shallow, a series of tiny, controlled sips of air, as if even the sound of her own lungs might betray our location. I lay beside her, my body a coiled spring of pure terror. Every nerve was alight, translating the faintest rustle of the tent fabric into the sound of footsteps, the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines into a menacing breath. My imagination, a faculty I usually prided myself on, had become my tormentor, painting vivid, horrific images in the canvas of the dark, a disfigured man dragging a rusty metal trap, a piece of abandoned mining equipment come to malevolent life, one of Ranger Miller's two-legged critters, with a broken loudspeaker strapped to its back, announcing its presence for some sick, unknowable reason. The logical part of my brain tried to fight back. It was a bear, I told myself, knocking over a metal trash can in an abandoned cabin. It was a prank by local kids. It was a park vehicle malfunctioning. But none of it fit. The sound was too loud, too deliberate, too wrong. It was a sound designed to inspire fear, and it had succeeded beyond measure. I could feel the cold seeping up from the ground, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold of absolute vulnerability. We were miles from any help, with no way to call for it. The thin nylon walls of our tent, which had felt like a fortress just hours before, now seemed as fragile as paper. We were exposed to two soft-shelled creatures in a vast, indifferent wilderness that now felt actively hostile. Another stretch of time crawled by. The silence remained unbroken. The fear didn't lessen, but it began to change. The sharp, heart-pounding panic slowly curdled into a thick, simmering dread. The immediate threat of the noise was replaced by the looming horror of what might happen next. Were we being watched? Was something circling our campsite, waiting for us to fall asleep again? Were we being hunted? The thought was a spark in the kindling of my fear. We couldn't just lie here. We couldn't wait for the sun to rise, which felt like a lifetime away. Waiting meant ceding control, becoming passive victims in whatever twisted game was being played. The image of us huddled in the tent until dawn, only to be discovered by whatever it was, filled me with a new kind of terror, one that finally spurred me to action. We have to go, I whispered, the words feeling loud and clumsy in the stillness. Clara flinched, turning her head towards me. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her question hanging in the air. Go where? Into the pitch, black forest that held the source of our terror. We can't stay here, Clara, I insisted, my voice gaining a sliver of conviction. We'll be quiet. We'll get in the car and we'll just drive. We'll go back to the ranger station. We won't stop. For a long moment, she said nothing. I could hear the debate raging within her, the primal fear of leaving the relative safety of our shelter warring with the logic of my words. Finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The decision was made. A plan, however desperate, was better than no plan at all. Okay, I said, my own voice a shaky imitation of a leader. Okay, we moved slow, no sudden noises. My first task was to get a weapon. It was a ridiculous thought. What good would I be against whatever made that sound? But the primitive need for something to hold, something to fight back with, was overwhelming. We had brought a large machete, still in its plastic packaging, for clearing brush if needed. It was in my duffel bag at the foot of the tent. Moving with excruciating slowness, I began to inch my way out of my sleeping bag. The rustle of the synthetic fabric sounded like a roaring inferno in my ears. I froze after every movement, listening, straining to hear anything over the frantic thumping of my own blood. Nothing. The forest remained silent. I reached my bag and my fingers fumbled for the zipper. It felt like defusing a bomb. I pulled it open a millimeter at a time, the metallic rasp of the teeth grating on my nerves. Inside, my hand closed around the hard plastic handle of the machete. I pulled it free. The plastic wrap crinkled, a sound so loud I was sure it could be heard for miles. I paused again, my body rigid, my ears ringing. Silence. With trembling fingers, I tore the plastic off the blade, freeing the long, heavy piece of steel. It felt cold and clumsy in my hand, a useless talisman against a supernatural sound, but it was better than nothing. The next challenge was the tent zipper. It was the final barrier between our fragile haven and the unknown horror of the night. My hand hovered over the metal tab for a full minute. This was it. The moment we left the illusion of safety behind. I looked towards Clara, a dark shape in the darkness. I had to do this for her. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the zipper and pulled. I didn't do it slowly. I ripped it open in one swift, violent motion, to sound like a tearing scream in the night. I plunged out of the tent, the machete held awkwardly in front of me, my eyes trying to pierce the oppressive blackness. The air was cold on my face. The dying embers of our fire cast a faint, hellish glow on the ground, just enough to turn the familiar shapes of trees and rocks into monstrous silhouettes. The world was a mess of shifting shadows and deep, impenetrable darkness. Clara was right behind me, a silent phantom in the gloom. We didn't speak. There was no need. The plan was simple: get our most essential items. Keys, wallets, and get to the car. We moved like spies in a bad movie, crouching low, our steps deliberate and soft on the pine, needle-strewn ground. I kept the machete pointed towards the darkness of the gravel road, the direction the sound had come from. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my chest. As Clara slipped into the passenger seat, I did one last, sweeping glance at the campsite. My eyes scanned the clearing, the fire pit, the picnic table, and then I saw it. It was sitting on the ground right next to our dead fire, no more than 15 feet from our tent. It was a beer can. A simple aluminum can of a cheap domestic brand. It glinted faintly in the last vestiges of light from the embers, and my blood ran cold. We hadn't brought any beer. We had juice boxes and water bottles, all of which were either in the car or locked in the bear box. We were meticulously clean campers. It was a point of pride for Clara. We left nothing behind. That kid hadn't been there when we went to bed. The implication crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. Someone had been here. While we slept, someone had walked into our campsite, stood by our fire, and had a beer. They had been watching us. They had been feet away from our tent, close enough to hear us breathe, listening to us sleep. The silence we had been hiding in wasn't empty. It had been filled with a quiet, patient observer. The mechanical grinding wasn't a warning. It was a prelude. Or perhaps a celebration. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. The machete felt like a child's toy. The threat wasn't some distant, abstract noise anymore. It was human. It was close, and it was toying with us. "Henry, get in!" Clara's voice was a sharp, terrified hiss from the car. Her voice broke the spell. I didn't need any more encouragement. I scrambled into the driver's seat, fumbling the keys into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. The engine turning over was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I slammed the car into reverse, not caring about the screech of the tires on the gravel, and spun the wheel, pointing us back towards the main road, towards civilization, towards safety. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see a figure standing by the fire pit, holding another beer, watching us run. I just floored the accelerator, and we shot out of Creek Bend Site 7, leaving our tent, our supplies, and our sense of security behind in the suffocating, watchful darkness of Whispering Pines. The tires screamed in protest on the loose gravel, the car fishtailing wildly before I wrestled it under control. My foot was welded to the accelerator. Trees became a solid black wall on either side of us, a terrifying tunnel that the car's headlights barely managed to penetrate. Every shadow that leaped and danced at the edge of the light was a figure about to spring onto the road. My eyes flicked compulsively to the rearview mirror every few seconds, fully expecting to see a pair of headlights snap on behind us to begin the chase I was certain was coming. But there was nothing, just an all-consuming darkness that seemed to swallow the road as soon as we passed over it. Clara was completely silent in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the dashboard, her knuckles white. She stared straight ahead, her face a pale, emotionless mask. It was a terrifying stillness, the kind that comes after a mind has been pushed past its breaking point. The vibrant, life-loving woman who had practically vibrated with excitement just this afternoon was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. A fresh wave of guilt and rage washed over me. I had brought her here. I had wanted to give her the wilderness she loved, and instead I had led her into a nightmare. Just a little further, I said, my voice hoarse. We'll hit the paved road soon. We'll get to the ranger station. The ranger station. The word sounded like a prayer. In my mind, Ranger Miller had become a symbol of safety and authority, his log cabin a fortress of civilization in this hostile wilderness. He would have a radio. He would have a shotgun. He would know what to do. His serious warning from earlier no longer felt like a folksy piece of advice. It felt like a prophecy we had foolishly ignored. The 5 miles of gravel road felt like 100. Twice, I had to swerve to avoid a deer that had frozen in our headlights, its eyes wide with terror. Or maybe it was terror of us, of the frantic, speeding machine tearing through its silent world. Finally, the bumpy, rattling ride smoothed out as our tires hit asphalt. We were on the main park road. A small measure of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The forest was still there, pressing in on us, a dark and watchful presence. I didn't slow down. The image of that beer can, a simple object now imbued with so much menace, was burned into my mind. It was a message I was here. I watched you. I let you go. We raced towards the ranger station, the only destination that made sense. We couldn't just drive out of the park. What would we tell the police? That we heard a scary noise and saw a piece of litter. They'd think we were crazy or drunk. No, we needed Ranger Miller. We needed an authority figure who understood these woods to validate our terror. As we rounded the final bend, I saw it. The ranger station was dark. No welcoming porch light, no plume of smoke from the chimney. The entire cabin was a black silhouette against the slightly less black, star-dusted sky. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Of course he was asleep. It was the middle of the night. But I had pictured a light on, a beacon in the darkness. I pulled the car to a stop in the dirt lot, the engines ticking sounding unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Stay here. Lock the doors. I commanded, my voice steadier than I felt. I grabbed the machete from the back seat. It still felt useless, but I couldn't bear to be empty-handed. Clara just nodded, her eyes still fixed on some point in the distance. I watched her press the lock button, the thunk of the mechanism echoing in the night. The air outside was frigid. I moved towards the cabin, my feet crunching on the gravel. Every step felt like a betrayal of the car's metal shell. I was out in the open again. Vulnerable. I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak. Hello? Silence. I reached the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I was about to knock when I noticed something wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness in the cabin's dark facade. My heart began to hammer against my ribs again. Rangers didn't leave their doors open. Not out here. Ranger Miller. I called again, louder this time, my hand tightening on the machete's handle. The only answer was the whisper of the wind. Against every instinct screaming at me to run back to the car, I pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a room steeped in shadow, smelling of cold wood smoke and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant. My phone. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut a sharp, white cone through the darkness, landing on the main room. It was a scene of quiet chaos. The large wooden desk was in disarray, papers scattered across its surface and onto the floor. The big topographical map was still on the wall, but a long, deep gash had been torn through it, right across the area where our campsite was located. A half-empty mug of what looked like coffee sat on the desk, a film of mold beginning to form on its surface. It looked like he'd left in a hurry. I took a hesitant step inside. Ranger. My light beam swept across the room. It caught the glint of metal in a corner. Not just one piece of metal. Piled in the corner was a heap of personal items, a child's hiking boot, a single earring, a dented canteen, a camera with a cracked lens, a set of car keys. It was a magpie's nest of lost things. A cold, horrifying realization began to dawn on me. These weren't just lost items. This was a trophy collection. These belonged to the people who had gone missing. And then I heard it. It started as a low hum, coming from a back room. And then it grew, building into that same soul-shaking, mechanical grinding shriek we had heard at the campsite. It was inside the cabin with me. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by a fear so pure and absolute it felt like my blood had turned to ice. The sound was deafening, vibrating through the wooden floorboards, through the soles of my shoes, up into my bones. It stopped as abruptly as it began, plunging the world back into a ringing silence. From the back room, I heard a slow, heavy footstep, and then another. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness behind him. It was Ranger Miller, but it wasn't the same man. The warm, crinkled smile was gone, replaced by a slack, jawed, vacant expression. His eyes, when they caught my flashlight beam, were flat and dead like a doll's eyes. He was holding a strange device in his hands, a rusty metal box with a large conical horn attached to it, like an old gramophone. A series of cranks and gears covered its surface. It was the source of the noise. "Figured you'd be back," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, completely devoid of the warmth it had held before. They usually are. They always think the ranger can help. He took a step towards me. My flashlight beam fell onto the wall behind him, and I saw them. Pinned to the wall were dozens of driver's licenses. Photos of smiling, hopeful faces. Men, women, families. The missing people? "The woods don't play tricks, son," Miller said, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. "I do. The two-leg critter." It was him. It had always been him. He wasn't a guardian of this forest. He was its monster. He lured people to the most isolated spots, terrorized them with his machine, hunted them for sport, and collected his trophies. The Birkin wasn't a threat. It was a signature. My mind finally broke free from its paralysis. I didn't scream. I didn't try to fight. I just turned and ran. I burst out of the cabin, vaulted over the porch railing, and sprinted for the car, the machine completely forgotten, dropped somewhere on the cabin floor.
"Etchy and I!"
Clara screamed from inside the car as she saw me running, her face a mask of terror as she saw the figure of Ranger Miller emerge onto the porch behind me. I ripped the driver's side door open and threw myself inside. "Yo!" was all I could manage to yell at myself as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't bother with reverse this time. I cranked the wheel and stomped on the gas, driving straight over the low, lying shrubs at the edge of the lot and onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him. Ranger Miller stood on the porch, bathed in the red glow of our taillights. He wasn't chasing us. He was just watching, the noise machine held loosely at his side. And he was slowly, deliberately raising a can of beer to his lips. We drove all night. We didn't stop until the sun was up, and we were 100 miles away, in a bustling town that felt like another planet. We walked into a police station, reeking of campfire and terror, and told our story. The officer behind the desk listened with a patient, skeptical look on his face. He took our statement, but his eyes said it all. A scary noise and a creepy ranger. He promised to have the local sheriff check it out. We never heard from them again. We never went back for our tent. A week later, I found a small article from a local paper online. The body of a veteran park ranger, Arthur Miller, had been found in Whispering Pines National Forest. He had apparently fallen into a ravine while on patrol. The article mentioned he was a beloved member of the community. It also mentioned that the park had a long, unfortunate history of hikers going missing, a testament to the dangers of the vast, untamed wilderness. The cases were all still open. Clara never spoke of that night again. The light in her eyes, the one that always burned brightest when she talked about the mountains, is gone. Sometimes I see her staring out a window, and I know she's back in that forest. I am too. I'm a city boy, and I'm supposed to be afraid of the concrete jungle. But I know the truth. The real monsters don't hide in the shadows of skyscrapers. They hide in plain sight in the deep, dark, beautiful woods, wearing a friendly smile and a ranger's uniform. My name is Isabella Rossi, and for the past 8 years, I've been a wilderness ranger with the United States Forest Service. My posting is in the Santa Fe National Forest, a sprawling expanse of over 1.6 million acres in the heart of New Mexico. It's a land of stark, breathtaking contrasts. High desert mesas baked by a relentless sun give way to cool, shadowy canyons carved by ancient rivers, and dense forests of ponderosa pine and aspen climb the flanks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. My job officially is to patrol these lands, maintain trails, educate the public, and occasionally assist in search and rescue operations. Unofficially, I see myself as a custodian of its stories, a guardian of its deep and often unsettling history. Most people who take this job are drawn by the solitude, the rugged independence, and the sheer, untamed beauty of it all. I was too. But there was another, deeper pull for me, the mysteries. Every ranger station has its collection of cold cases, binders thick with dust and unanswered questions. Reports of strange lights, hikers who vanish from well-marked trails, and encounters with animals that don't fit any biological classification. Here in Santa Fe, however, our most persistent and unnerving enigma was the structures. The official files called them unauthorized temporary constructions. The old-timers had other names: witch kivas, spirit traps, deadwood teepees. The descriptions were eerily consistent, stretching back over 50 years. Deep in the backcountry, far from any road or established trail, they would simply appear. They were large, conical structures, sometimes reaching 20 feet in height, built not with skill or craft, but with a kind of frantic, obsessive energy. Thousands of pieces of deadwood, fallen branches, splintered logs, brittle limbs were woven and stacked into a dense, almost impenetrable lattice. The most disturbing detail was their creation. They would materialize overnight. A patrol would pass through a clearing one day and find nothing but pine needles and dirt. The next, a massive wooden cone would dominate the landscape. There were never any tracks, not from people, not from vehicles, not even the disturbed earth you'd expect from dozens of individuals hauling thousands of pounds of wood. It was as if the materials had assembled themselves. The official explanation, the one trotted out for the rare news inquiry, was always the same: a fire risk built by pranksters, or perhaps a transient cult. I never bought it. I'd seen the photographs. I'd read the reports. The sheer logistics were impossible. The amount of labor required to build one of these things in a week, let alone a single night, was staggering. And for what? A prank. It felt wrong. The structures had a presence, an aura described in the reports as deeply malevolent. Rangers who found them spoke of a heavy silence, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, a sudden, inexplicable urge to flee. My fascination became an obsession during a long, quiet winter. With the high country buried in snow, I had time. I pulled every file related to the structures, some dating back to the 1960s. I spread topographical maps across the floor of my small cabin, the scent of old paper and stale coffee filling the air. Each report had a grid coordinate for the sighting. I began marking them with red pins. At first, they seemed random, scattered across a 50-mile radius. But as more pins dotted the map, a shape began to emerge from the chaos. It wasn't a line or a cluster. It was a spiral. A slow, deliberate spiral, its arms wrapping tighter and tighter as they approached a central point. My blood ran cold when I saw it. This wasn't random. This was intentional. This was a pattern. I followed the curve of the pins, my finger tracing the path towards its inevitable conclusion. The vortex of the spiral converged on a remote, unnamed network of canyons in the northwestern sector of the forest, a place so rugged and inaccessible it was designated as a trailless wilderness area. It was a blank spot on the map, a place no one ever went because there was no reason to. Until now. As soon as the spring thaw made the high country passable, I knew I had to go. I couldn't justify the expedition officially. Sir, I'd like to request a multi-day patrol to investigate a geometric pattern I found in 50 years of crank reports. I would have been laughed out of the station, probably put on desk duty. So, I fabricated a plausible mission, a solo trip to survey for invasive bark beetle infestations in the upper canyon systems. It was a legitimate enough task that it wouldn't raise eyebrows. The hike took 2 days. The first day was standard backcountry trekking, the familiar rhythm of boots on dirt, the weight of the pack a comforting presence. But as I pushed deeper, following the invisible line of the spiral, the character of the forest began to change. The air grew still and heavy. The cheerful chatter of birds and squirrels faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow sound. The trees themselves seemed older, more gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. A primal sense of unease settled in my gut, the ancient part of the human brain that knows when it has strayed into a predator's territory. By the afternoon of the second day, I had reached the canyon pinpointed as the spiral's center. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, its walls a dark, volcanic rock that seemed to absorb the sunlight. I stood on the rim, a wave of vertigo washing over me. This place felt wrong. Unhallowed, I made my way down a treacherous scree slope, my boots dislodging streams of loose rock that clattered into the abyss below. The bottom of the canyon was a narrow, shadowy corridor, and there in a small, circular clearing I saw it. It was new. The wood was still pale, the raw, splintered ends of the branches a stark white against the dark forest floor. It was a perfect cone, just as the reports had described, a chaotic yet strangely elegant monument of dead things. It rose at least 15 feet, its base a solid 20 feet across, a gaping dark maw for an entrance. The silence was absolute, my breath hitched in my throat. It was real. After all the files, all the maps, all the theories, here it was, and it had been built within the last few weeks. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into my veins. This wasn't a historical artifact. This was active. I forced my legs to move, my training battling my instinct to run. I had to document it. I unslung my pack, my hands fumbling as I pulled out my camera. I took photos from every angle, the digital click of the shutter sounding like a gunshot in the profound quiet. Then I approached the entrance. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of decay and dry rot. Peering into the darkness, I could make out the internal structure. A central support beam, a massive dead log with hundreds of smaller branches leaning against it. And propped against that central support, catching a single, stray beam of light that pierced the gloom, was a small rectangular object. My heart hammered against my ribs. I switched on my headlamp, its beam cutting a sharp white circle in the darkness. I stepped inside, the ground soft with a thick layer of dust and pine needles. I knelt, reaching out a trembling hand. It was a wallet. A man's leather wallet, weathered and worn. I opened it. Tucked neatly into the plastic sleeve was a New Mexico driver's license. The face in the photo was smiling, a man in his late 20s with kind eyes and a sun-burnt nose. I recognized him instantly from the bulletin board back at the station. He was a hiker who had gone missing from a trail 30 miles south of here. Just last week, the world seemed to shrink to the size of the headlamp beam, illuminating the smiling face on the driver's license. Michael Turner, age 28. The name and face swam in my vision, a ghost from a bulletin board now made terrifyingly real. My training, the years of drilling and protocol screamed at me. Crime scene. Do not contaminate. Report immediately. But another, more primal part of my brain was screaming something else entirely. Get out. Get out now. The air inside the structure was frigid, a dead, stagnant cold that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The smell of rot was overpowering, and beneath it, a strange electric tang like ozone after a lightning strike. My hand, still holding the wallet, was shaking violently. I forced myself to take a steadying breath, the icy air burning my lungs. I was 2 days hike from my truck out of radio range and on an unsanctioned patrol. Reporting this wasn't as simple as clicking a button on my radio. It meant hiking back through that silent, watching forest, knowing what I now knew, knowing that this place wasn't just a collection of old, weird stories. It was a grave, or worse. The thought spurred me to action. I couldn't just leave. Michael Turner was still out here. Maybe he was injured, incapacitated somewhere nearby. Leaving his wallet here felt like a deliberate act, a message. But what kind of message? I carefully placed the wallet into an evidence bag from my pack, my movements stiff and robotic. I backed out of the structure, my headlamp beam sweeping across the oppressive darkness of the canyon. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague unease. It was a physical pressure, a weight on my skin. My mission had changed. This was no longer about historical patterns or personal obsessions. This was a search and rescue, or more likely, a recovery. I had to do a perimeter search. It was standard procedure. Look for tracks, for signs of a struggle, for discarded gear. I started circling the base of the deadwood cone, my boots crunching softly on the gravelly soil. The first thing that struck me yet again was the impossible neatness of it all. There were no drag marks, no scuffed earth, no footprints other than my own leading into the canyon. It was as if the 20-foot structure and the wallet within it had been lowered from the sky. About 30 yards from the structure, half hidden under a gnarled juniper bush, I found his backpack. It was a high-end Osprey pack, the kind serious hikers use. It wasn't torn or damaged, but it looked like it had been deliberately placed, not dropped in a hurry. My dread deepened. People in distress don't neatly stow their survival gear. I unclipped the buckles. His tent, sleeping bag, and stove were all there, but it was the side pocket that held the second piece of the puzzle. It was a small, leather-bound journal, the kind with a little elastic band to keep it closed. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first dozen pages were exactly what you'd expect from a hiking journal. Observations about the weather, descriptions of scenic views, notes on his daily mileage. The handwriting was neat, confident. Then it changed. About 4 days before his official disappearance, the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, the handwriting more jagged. Day 50, strange day. Felt like I was walking in circles, even with the GPS. The birds are gone. Haven't heard one all afternoon. Just quiet. A heavy quiet. Day 6, I'm sure I'm being followed. No sound, no sight of anyone. But the feeling is overwhelming. Like eyes on my back all day. I keep spinning around finding nothing. Am I losing it? The silence is the worst part. It's not empty. It's full of waiting. Day 7, I found one of them. The wooden things. It wasn't on any map. It just was there. In a clearing it hums. Not a sound, a feeling, a vibration in my teeth. I shouldn't have gone closer. But it pulls you in, I left. I ran. I think I ran the right way, but now I'm not so sure. The sun is setting. The woods are so dark. The final entry was barely legible. The pen strokes dug so deep they had torn the page. It was dated the day he was reported missing. It wants me to build. The whispers aren't whispers. They're thoughts. They're instructions. In my head, they show me the branches, the dead ones. They show me how they fit. A nest, a home, a trap. I have to. It's the only way to make the noise stop. The wood is so hungry. My hands are bleeding. I have to make it quiet. I have to build. I slammed the journal shut, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He hadn't been dragged here. He had been drawn here, compelled. This structure wasn't a monument to his death. He had been the instrument of its creation. The thought was so horrific, so far outside the realm of anything I had ever encountered, that I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a human killer. This was something else, something ancient and parasitic that used people as its tools. As if summoned by my thoughts, a sound echoed from deeper down the canyon. It was a soft, wet, clicking noise. A series of glottal stops and pops that sounded sickeningly organic. It was the kind of sound a large insect might make, or a bird with a throat full of mud. I froze, every muscle tensed. I killed my headlamp, plunging the world into the deep twilight of the canyon floor. My eyes struggled to adjust, turning the landscape into a terrifying canvas of gray and black shapes. The clicking came again, closer this time. It was rhythmic. And then I heard the voice. It was a thin, reedy whisper that slithered through the trees. So quiet, make it quiet. It was Michael Turner's voice, or a horrifying mimicry of it. It was his words from the journal, but the cadence was wrong, the inflection flat and hollow, devoid of any human emotion. It was like a parrot trying to imitate a scream. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through my training. This was the predator. This was the thing that had filled the silence, the thing that had whispered instructions into a lost hiker's mind. I shoved the journal into my pack, grabbed it, and ran. I didn't care about procedure or contaminating the scene. I scrambled up the scree slope I had so carefully descended, my lungs heaving, loose rocks cascading behind me. The clicking and the whispering followed, keeping pace with me from the canyon floor. It didn't seem to be hurrying. It didn't need to. It knew the forest was its home, and I was just a terrified trespasser. When I reached the rim gasping for air, I didn't look back. I ran. I ran through the gnarled, watching trees, the oppressive silence of the forest now filled with the phantom echoes of that terrible voice. The 2-day hike back to my truck became a single, desperate flight, fueled by adrenaline and terror. I didn't sleep. I didn't stop. Every shadow was a threat, every snap of a twig a prelude to an attack. The forest was no longer my sanctuary. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I burst through the door of the ranger station just after dawn, looking like a wild thing. My clothes were torn, my face scratched, my eyes wide with exhaustion and paranoia. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Dave, was just pouring his morning coffee. He took one look at me and his jaw tightened. "Isabella, what the hell happened to you? You were supposed to be surveying for beetles." I didn't answer. I walked to his desk, appended my pack, and dumped the contents. The camera, the bagged wallet, and the leather-bound journal skidded across his desk, coming to a stop next to his coffee mug. My voice was a raw, ragged whisper. "We need to call the sheriff and the state police. Michael Turner isn't just missing." I looked him in the eye, wanting him to understand the impossible truth of what I was saying. He was harvested. Dave stared at the word hanging in the air between us. Harvested. It was a strange, agricultural term, completely out of place in the context of a missing person case. It implied purpose, a crop being gathered. He didn't laugh or dismiss me. He was a man who had spent 30 years in these mountains, and he knew that the official language of reports and procedures was often inadequate for the things the forest kept hidden. He looked from my wild eyes to the journal on his desk, his gaze lingering on the torn, frantic final page. He slowly pushed his coffee cup aside, his expression grim. "All right, Rossi," he said, his voice low and steady. "Sit down. Tell me everything, from the beginning." And so I did. I told him about the old files, the spiral on the map, my unsanctioned survey. My voice, shaky at first, grew stronger as I recounted the oppressive silence, the discovery of the Deadwood Cone, and the contents of Michael Turner's journal. When I described the clicking sounds in the hollow, mimicking voice that had chased me from the canyon, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or a shared, buried fear, passed through Dave's eyes. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his hand steepled under his chin, until I finished. my story ending with the ragged whisper of my final word to him. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dave finally let out a long, slow breath. "I've heard stories," he said, almost to himself. "Old stories. From the Jicarilla Apache elders, from sheepherders back in the 70s. They talk about a thing that lives in the deep woods, a thing that steals voices. They call it the echo that eats." He shook his head as if trying to clear it. "I always filed it away with the Sasquatch sightings and the ghost lights. But a pattern, a spiral." He stood up. "You did the right thing. We're calling this in." The next few hours were a blur of official procedure that felt surreal and disconnected from the visceral terror I had experienced. The county sheriff, a portly man named Martinez with a perpetually skeptical expression, arrived with 2 deputies. They listened to my story, their faces impassive. I could see the disbelief in their eyes, the easy categorization of my experience into a box labeled hysterical witness suffering from exhaustion. They were interested in the wallet, the backpack, and the photos on my camera. They treated the journal as a curiosity, the tragic ramblings of a man lost and succumbing to madness. My descriptions of the creature, the voice, the impossible construction of the TP, were met with polite nods and scribbled notes that I knew would be dismissed in their final report. The decision was made to send a team back to the canyon at first light. I was expected to lead them. The thought of returning to that unhallowed place sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins, but I had no choice. It was my scene. I had to take them there. The return journey was profoundly different from my frantic escape. I was now part of a 6-person team myself, Dave Sheriff Martinez, and 3 deputies armed with shotguns and rifles. Their presence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Their loud talk, their clanking gear, their casual disbelief felt like a desecration, a foolish intrusion into a place that demanded silence and respect. They were treating it like a standard recovery operation, but I knew we were walking into a predator's lair. The forest seemed to feel it too. The silence was even deeper than before, as if the land itself was holding its breath waiting. When we reached the canyon rim, the mood shifted. Even the deputies, hardened and cynical, grew quiet as they looked down into the shadowy chasm. The place radiated a palpable wrongness that no amount of professional detachment could ignore. "Okay, Rossi," Martinez said, his voice a little tighter now. "Where is it?" I led them down the scree slope. As we reached the canyon floor, I saw it. The structure was still there, a silent, monstrous monument of deadwood against the dark rock. A collective gasp went through the group. The photos hadn't done it justice. Seeing it in person, feeling its presence, was something else entirely. "Sweet Mother of God," one of the deputies whispered. But something was wrong. The entrance, which had been a dark, gaping maw, was now sealed. A dense weave of fresh branches, many of them green and pliable, had been woven across the opening, blocking it completely. And the smell was different. The scent of dry rot was gone, replaced by the cloying, metallic odor of blood. Martinez and a deputy, their shotguns raised, carefully approached the sealed entrance. Dave and I hung back, my hand resting on the handle of the emergency flare gun on my hip, a useless but strangely comforting gesture. They used the butts of their rifles to pry apart the newly woven branches. As the opening widened, the smell intensified, a gut-wrenching wave of decay. From my vantage point, I could see inside. Michael Turner was there. But he wasn't just dead. His body was propped against the central support beam in the exact spot where I had found his wallet, and he had been integrated. Woven into the structure itself. Branches and vines had been threaded through his limbs and torso, lashing him to the wood, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. His skin was pale, but his hands and forearms were stained dark with dried blood and dirt, confirming the last terrible entry in his journal. He had built his own tomb. A deputy gagged and turned away. Even Martinez, his face pale, looked shaken. This was no longer a simple case of a hiker succumbing to the elements. This was a grotesque, ritualistic tableau. As they began the grim task of documenting the scene before cutting the body down, I felt it again, the vibration in my teeth, the low-frequency hum that Michael had described. It started subtly, then grew in intensity until the very air seemed to buzz. "Do you feel that?" I asked Dave, my voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes wide, scanning the canyon walls. "Sheriff," he yelled, "we need to get out of here. Now." And then the clicking started. It came from all around us, echoing off the canyon walls. A wet, chittering, organic sound that multiplied, creating a disorienting, horrifying chorus. It was the sound I had heard before, but now it was 100 times louder. The deputies spun around, their weapons raised, their eyes darting into the shadows, but there was nothing to see. Then the voices began. It wasn't just Michael Turner's voice anymore. There were others. A woman crying for help, a child calling for his mother, a man speaking in rapid, terrified Spanish. It was a cacophony of stolen last words, a symphony of terror broadcast from the rocks around us. It was the echo that eats, and it was mocking us with its collection of souls. That was what finally broke them. The deputies fell back, their faces masks of pure terror. Sheriff Martinez, to his credit, held his ground long enough to yell, "Get the body! Let's go!" The extraction was a chaotic, panicked scramble. They cut Michael's body free and hauled it out, a clumsy, desperate retreat from the unseen, chattering horror that surrounded us. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the sun high in the sky, the sounds of the canyon finally fading behind us. The official report listed Michael Turner's cause of death as undetermined, with contributing factors of exposure and dehydration. The structure was officially classified as a ritualistic suicide scene, created by the victim in a state of psychosis. My testimony was heavily edited, my descriptions of the creature and its voice omitted entirely. The other voices, the clicking, it was all attributed to auditory hallucinations brought on by a high-stress environment and echoing acoustics. The case was closed. But I know what I saw. I have the map in my cabin. The red pins forming their sinister spiral. I've added a new pin, a black one, for the day we recovered Michael Turner. The spiral isn't just a map of where the structures have been found. It's a map of its feeding ground. The case may be closed, but the forest remembers. The echo is still out there in the deep, silent places. And it's waiting. It's always waiting for the next lost voice to add to its collection. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that it's only a matter of time before it builds again.